I am Vivian, 61 years old, and a retired senior compliance director for the Internal Revenue Service. At my husband's funeral, the heavy gray clouds finally broke, unleashing a violent and freezing rain over the cemetery. I stood perfectly still by the polished mahogany casket, listening to the pastor recite the final prayers. Elijah Dubois, my husband of 15 years, was supposedly resting inside that sealed box, the victim of a tragic and sudden boating accident off the coast. But as the small crowd of mourners began to rush toward their luxury cars to escape the downpour, a frail man in a dark rain slicker stepped out from behind a large marble headstone. It was the old Gravedigger. I recognized him instantly. Decades ago, he had been a key confidential informant for me during a massive federal tax fraud investigation. He looked around frantically, his eyes darting through the thick fog, before he pulled me aside behind a large oak tree. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice trembling violently over the sound of the heavy rain. "The coffin is empty." I stared at him, the freezing water dripping down my face. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my heart suddenly pounding violently against my ribs. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "I prepared the burial vault this morning," he stammered. "The box is completely hollow. Be careful, Vivian. Your husband was hiding something terrible." When I looked back at the open grave, my blood ran completely cold. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to bury someone's lies to uncover your own truth, and stand up to entitled family members who severely underestimated your intelligence. Growing up in a strict and hardworking household, I was taught that numbers never lie, even when people do. That philosophy guided my entire life. For 35 years, I worked as a senior compliance director for the federal government. I dismantled complex offshore shell companies, audited fraudulent corporations, and tracked down millions of dollars in hidden assets. I was a human lie detector with a federal badge. I built a very quiet but incredibly substantial personal fortune through smart real estate investments. My husband Elijah was the exact opposite. He was a highly charismatic local real estate developer who loved the spotlight, the expensive cigars, and the flashy cars. He played the generous community leader, but the absolute truth was that I quietly subsidized his lavish lifestyle. He had a biological son named Kendrick from his first marriage. Kendrick was 38 years old and possessed all of his father's blinding arrogance, but absolutely none of his charm. I had personally paid for Kendrick's expensive college tuition and bailed out his failing luxury car dealership 3 separate times. Yet Kendrick and his deeply entitled white wife Lauren resented me completely. Lauren treated my beautiful home like she was the actual lady of the manor, constantly looking down her nose at me. I stood in the muddy grass of the cemetery, staring at the wooden casket as it was slowly lowered into the ground. The old gravedigger slipped away into the thick fog, leaving me entirely alone with a terrifying revelation. An empty coffin, a closed casket funeral due to supposedly severe water trauma. It all made a sickening kind of sense. Elijah had been acting incredibly erratic over the last few months, constantly locking himself in his home office and shredding financial documents. As a former federal auditor, my mind instantly began connecting the data points. Elijah was not dead. He was running. But I did not have the luxury of standing in the rain to solve the mystery right then. I had to maintain appearances. I turned around, got into my sleek black sedan, and drove directly to Mount Calvary Church for the traditional funeral repast. The church basement was packed with members of our affluent social circle. The air was thick with the comforting smells of fried chicken, baked macaroni and cheese, and strong coffee. Women in large black hats and men in tailored dark suits offered me their hushed condolences as I walked through the double doors. I kept my posture perfectly straight, nodding politely and thanking them for their prayers. I was operating on pure adrenaline, my mind rapidly processing the massive financial and legal implications of a faked death. I walked over to the long buffet table and picked up a small porcelain plate, hoping to find a quiet corner to gather my thoughts. I just needed 10 minutes to mentally review my personal bank accounts and secure my assets. But my moment of peace was violently interrupted. I heard the sharp, aggressive clicking of expensive designer heels slamming against the cheap linoleum floor. I turned around and saw my stepson Kendrick and his wife Lauren marching aggressively toward me. They did not look like two people who had just buried their beloved patriarch. They looked like two vultures circling a fresh kill. Lauren was wearing a tight and entirely inappropriate black cocktail dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled. She stopped right in front of me, her lips curling into a wicked and incredibly smug smile. Without saying a single word of greeting, she shoved a folded plastic moving box directly into my chest. The sudden impact forced me to drop my porcelain plate onto the buffet table with a loud clatter. I looked down at the cheap plastic container and then slowly raised my eyes to meet her arrogant stare. "What exactly is this, Lauren?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any emotion. Lauren crossed her arms over her chest, loudly snapping her chewing gum. "That is for your personal items, Vivian," she announced, her shrill voice carrying over the low hum of the crowded church basement. Several people standing near the dessert table turned their heads to watch the commotion. "We need your keys to the master estate immediately. Kendrick is the man of the house now, and we have a lot of work to do. Your taste in decor is incredibly outdated and honestly a bit depressing. We are going to completely modernize the living room before we move our furniture in, so you have until Sunday evening to pack your clothes and vacate the premises." I stood completely still, letting the sheer audacity of her words hang in the humid air of the church basement. She was standing mere feet away from the pastor, just hours after a funeral, demanding the keys to a $3 million home that I had purchased, furnished, and maintained with my own money. She actually believed that because my husband was supposedly dead, she and her pathetic husband had instantly inherited my entire life. I did not scream. I did not throw my drink in her face. I operated with the cold and calculated precision of a federal auditor. I carefully set the plastic moving box down on the table next to the dinner rolls. I looked at Lauren, sweeping my gaze up and down her inappropriate outfit. "Lauren," I said, projecting my voice clearly so the gossiping church members could hear every single syllable. "You must have caught a terrible fever in the rain today. I own that house. I paid off the mortgage in full 5 years ago. Kendrick has absolutely no legal or moral authority over my property, and neither do you. Now step out of my face and show some respect before I embarrass you in the house of the Lord." Lauren flushed a deep and angry shade of crimson, taking a step backward. But Kendrick immediately stepped forward to shield his wife, puffing out his chest and glaring at me with pure hatred. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He shoved the paperwork aggressively toward my face. "You are completely wrong, Vivian," Kendrick snapped, his voice dripping with triumphant malice. "This is an emergency court order granting me full temporary control of the entire Dubois family estate." I took the document from his hand, my eyes instantly scanning the bold legal print at the top of the page. My heart skipped a beat, but my face remained a mask of absolute stone. Kendrick leaned in closer to me, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and cheap mints. He smiled wickedly, revealing his perfectly whitened teeth. "Dad knew you would be difficult and selfish," Kendrick whispered maliciously. "He knew you would try to steal what rightfully belongs to my bloodline. That is exactly why he went to his lawyer and completely changed his last will and testament last month. You get nothing, Vivian, absolutely nothing." I stared at the emergency court order in my hands. The gravedigger's terrified voice echoed loudly in my mind. "The coffin is empty." Suddenly, the entire picture came into absolute crystal-clear focus. Elijah had not just faked his own death to escape a few bad business deals. He had orchestrated a massive and highly coordinated financial hit job against me. He had forged a new will, appointed his greedy son as the attack dog, and planned to drain my massive estate while he disappeared into the wind. He thought he could outsmart a retired senior compliance director. He thought I would simply crumble under the grief and hand over the keys to my kingdom. He was incredibly, fatally wrong. The funeral was over, but the actual war was just beginning. The morning after the funeral, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the air outside my window thick and heavy with humidity. I was sitting at my large granite kitchen island, drinking my black coffee and staring out at the manicured backyard. I was still deeply processing the chilling words of the old gravedigger when the aggressive ringing of my doorbell shattered the quiet morning silence. I walked down the long hardwood hallway and opened my heavy wooden front door to find my stepson Kendrick, his entitled wife Lauren, and a short, balding man holding a cheap leather briefcase. Kendrick did not even wait for me to politely invite them inside. He simply pushed his way past me, stepping onto my expensive imported rugs with his muddy designer shoes. Lauren followed closely behind him, smirking wickedly as she glanced around my grand foyer, as if she already owned the place. The balding man nervously cleared his throat and introduced himself as Attorney Miller. He stated he was there to officially execute the final wishes and legal estate of my late husband, Elijah Dubois. I led the three of them into my formal living room, keeping my facial expression completely neutral and guarded. Kendrick immediately sat down in my favorite velvet armchair, crossing his legs with absolute arrogance. Attorney Miller opened his scuffed briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers bound in a dark blue protective folder. Mrs. Dubois, the lawyer, began, his voice dripping with false sympathy and rehearsed pity. Your husband visited my office exactly 1 month before his tragic boating accident. He was deeply concerned about the future of his biological bloodline and requested a complete and total revision of his estate planning. The lawyer slid a crisp white document across my polished mahogany coffee table. According to this newly executed last will and testament, Elijah has legally left his entire $3 million estate, including this primary residence and all of his massive life insurance policies, entirely to his only son, Kendrick. I stared at the paper and then looked up at the sweating lawyer. I calmly reminded the man that my husband could not legally give away a house that was purchased entirely with my own money. I explained that we had absolutely no prenuptial agreement that would ever allow him to steal my personal assets. Kendrick leaned forward, laughing bitterly. That is where you are completely wrong, Vivian, he snapped, snapping his fingers at the lawyer to continue. Attorney Miller quickly pulled out another document and placed it right next to the fake will. Your husband provided us with a legally signed postnuptial agreement, the lawyer explained smoothly. It clearly states that you willingly surrendered all your equity in this property and agreed to completely waive your rights to his life insurance benefits in the event of his passing. The document claims you agreed to step aside so his son could secure the Dubois family legacy. Lauren did not even bother looking at the complicated legal documents sitting on the table. She was already extremely busy pacing around my formal living room, running her manicured hands over my expensive antique side tables and loudly criticizing every single thing she saw. This entire room feels like a dusty old museum, she complained, wrinkling her nose in disgust as she aggressively inspected my custom silk curtains. We are definitely going to tear down these ugly floral drapes and paint the walls a bright, modern white. And we simply have to get rid of all this heavy mahogany furniture, Vivian. It is incredibly depressing and entirely out of style for a young, wealthy couple. Kendrick desperately needs a modern and sophisticated space to entertain his important business clients now that he is stepping up to take his father's place as a prominent community leader. I sat perfectly still on my comfortable sofa, watching this highly entitled woman plan the complete demolition of the beautiful sanctuary I had built with 40 years of my own hard work. Your husband is not a community leader, Lauren, I replied, my voice low and completely steady. Your husband is a serial failure who has never actually built anything by himself. Kendrick glared at me, his face turning a dark shade of anger, but I absolutely refused to stop speaking. Let us talk about the great Dubois family legacy, Kendrick. I continued, locking my eyes onto my furious stepson. Did your father tell his cheap lawyer that I paid your entire expensive out-of-state college tuition because he had recklessly gambled away your college fund? Did he mention that I quietly liquidated $200,000 from my own federal retirement account just 3 years ago to bail out your failing luxury car dealership? You like to pretend your father was a generous and wealthy patriarch who provided for everyone in this city. The absolute truth is that Elijah played the big man around town, using my personal bank accounts to fund his public charitable donations and his expensive tailored suits. You have spent your entire adult life living off the hard-earned money of a black woman you cannot even find the basic decency to respect." Lauren gasped dramatically, placing a hand over her chest, as if I had physically struck her across the face. "You are completely delusional and incredibly bitter, Vivian," she shrieked, her face turning a blotchy red with rage. "You are just jealous because Elijah finally realized you were completely suffocating him and chose to protect his real family." Kendrick stood up from the velvet armchair, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "You do not get to disrespect my father in this house anymore," he yelled aggressively. "This is my property now. The post-nuptial agreement is legally binding, and you have absolutely no power here. You are going to pack your cheap clothes and get out of my house before I call the local sheriff to have you forcefully evicted." I slowly lowered my gaze back down to the mahogany coffee table, looking closely at the supposed post-nuptial agreement. I reached out and picked up the crisp white paper, holding it up to the light. I did not need a magnifying glass or a handwriting expert to tell me exactly what I was looking at. For nearly 4 decades, I had worked at the highest levels of the Internal Revenue Service, examining thousands of fraudulent tax returns, forged corporate documents, and falsified signatures. My eyes were expertly trained to instantly spot the tiniest inconsistencies that ordinary people completely missed. I looked at the signature line at the bottom of the page where my name was supposedly written in dark blue ink. The loop on the capital letter was entirely wrong, and the pressure of the pen strokes was far too heavy. Furthermore, the official notary stamp pressed into the bottom of the document belonged to a man whose license had been permanently suspended 2 years ago for severe real estate fraud. Elijah had obviously paid a criminal associate to forge my signature on a fake legal document. The sheer arrogance of his plan was truly breathtaking. He actually believed he could slip a forged financial document past a retired senior compliance director of the federal government. But I knew that if I confronted them with the blatant forgery right now, Kendrick and his sleazy lawyer would immediately panic and try to destroy the physical evidence. I needed them to feel confident and entirely secure in their fraudulent victory. I needed them to leave the original documents in my possession so I could eventually use them to build an inescapable federal case against everyone involved. So I decided to give them exactly the pathetic performance they desperately wanted to see. I let my hands begin to tremble slightly, dropping the paper back onto the table. I allowed a single tear to pool in the corner of my eye and slowly roll down my cheek. I looked up at Kendrick, my face perfectly mimicking the expression of a devastated and completely broken widow. "How could Elijah do this to me?" I whispered, letting my voice crack with manufactured sorrow. "I gave him the best years of my life, and he left me with absolutely nothing." Kendrick smiled a cruel and deeply satisfied smile. He puffed out his chest, greatly enjoying the sight of my apparent defeat. He finally realized his massive mistake. "Vivian," he said coldly. The lawyer quickly packed up his briefcase, leaving the forged copies on my table, and the 3 of them marched out of my home completely triumphant. They thought they had entirely broken me. But the second the heavy front door clicked shut, my tears instantly vanished. I wiped my cheek and walked straight down the hallway to my husband's locked home office. Elijah thought he was a criminal mastermind, but he was incredibly sloppy. Years ago, I had secretly installed a hidden backdoor program on his private desktop computer to monitor his reckless spending habits. I booted up his machine and bypassed his security passwords in less than 2 minutes. I immediately accessed his primary life insurance portal to check the exact status of his massive policies. My eyes scanned the glowing screen, and my breath completely caught in my throat. A massive death benefit payout of exactly $5 million had already been approved and expedited. But the money had not been sent to Kendrick. The $5 million had just been successfully routed to an untraceable offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Elijah had stolen the money and left his own son to take the devastating fall. I sat perfectly still in the quiet of my home office, staring at the glowing computer screen. The offshore transfer confirmation burned into my retinas. $5 million had vanished into the Cayman Islands. As a retired senior compliance director, I knew that shell companies were never just simple hiding places. They were complex puzzle boxes designed to completely obscure the true identity of the owner. But I spent my entire career breaking open those exact boxes. I immediately tapped into my network of secure databases, running a deep trace on the destination routing numbers. I bypassed the superficial layers of the offshore trust and dug directly into the underlying corporate registry. It took me less than 2 hours to completely dismantle the elaborate financial wall my husband had built. The registered entity was called Apex Holdings, but the massive revelation was hidden in the associated liability files. I cross-referenced the corporate tax identification numbers with the Federal Registry and found an active federal investigation. Elijah was not just hiding money from me, he was actively running from the United States government. The files clearly showed that his local real estate development firm was the central target of a massive incoming federal indictment for severe real estate fraud and massive money laundering. The Department of Justice was preparing to drop the hammer on his entire operation within the next 30 days. Elijah had known the federal agents were closing in on him. He knew he was facing decades in federal prison. So he staged the tragic boating accident precisely when a massive storm was rolling over the coast, making it completely impossible for the Coast Guard to properly investigate the wreckage. He faked his own death to completely escape the federal indictment. He planned to take the $5 million in stolen life insurance money and permanently disappear into a tropical paradise. And his ultimate plan was to leave me holding the massive bag. He intentionally left his local business accounts completely overdrawn and loaded with millions of dollars in toxic debt. He expected the federal authorities and the angry loan sharks to tear my life apart while I was still mourning his fake death. He wanted me to be completely ruined and entirely bankrupt, so no one would ever suspect he had escaped with the actual fortune. I leaned back in my leather office chair, feeling a cold and terrifying clarity wash over my entire body. Elijah was a complete monster. He had used my pristine reputation to shield his fraudulent business for 15 years. And then he tried to throw me directly to the federal wolves to save his own skin. He assumed that because I was a deeply grieving widow, I would simply fall apart and surrender everything without a single fight. He drastically underestimated the pure resilience of a woman who had spent decades meticulously building her own independent fortress. But his massive financial web was about to catch someone else entirely. Later that same afternoon, the absolute chaos of his plan began to actively unravel. Kendrick had strutted into the massive downtown branch of the primary commercial bank, completely convinced he was about to become an instant millionaire. He genuinely believed that all his financial struggles were permanently over, and that he was finally stepping into his rightful place as the wealthy patriarch of the family. He had brought the forged last will and testament along with the fake postnuptial agreement, expecting the bank manager to immediately hand over the keys to his father's massive financial empire. Kendrick had completely planned to drain the remaining local accounts and spend the afternoon shopping for a brand new luxury vehicle. But when the branch manager ran his credentials through the main banking system, the screen flashed a massive red warning. The local accounts were not full of inherited wealth. They were completely frozen by federal order and massively overdrawn. The bank manager had looked at Kendrick with profound suspicion and informed him that the accounts were under active federal review for severe financial discrepancies. Kendrick had panicked completely. His massive ego and his desperate need for immediate cash completely blinded him to the actual reality of his situation. He stormed out of the bank lobby and drove his expensive car directly to my house. The front door flew open violently. Kendrick stomped into my living room, his face completely red with absolute fury. Lauren followed right behind him, wearing her expensive clothes and a deeply confused expression. "You completely froze the bank accounts, Vivian," he screamed at the top of his lungs, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You called the bank and told them to lock me out of my own father's money. You are illegally interfering with a certified legal document. I am the sole executor of this estate, and you have absolutely no right to touch those accounts." I sat calmly on my velvet sofa holding a delicate porcelain teacup. I did not say a word. I simply took a slow sip of my hot tea and watched him completely lose his mind. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" Kendrick continued pacing back and forth across my expensive rug. "You think because you worked for the government, you can just bully your way into my inheritance. But I'm not going to let you steal my family legacy. I'm going to call the local police right now and have you physically dragged out of this house. You are trespassing on my property, and you are stealing my money." Lauren nodded vigorously, crossing her arms and glaring at me with pure hatred. She was wearing a brand new designer outfit that she had undoubtedly purchased on credit, anticipating a massive windfall from the estate. "You are going to federal prison," Vivian Loren added, her shrill voice echoing in my quiet home. "You cannot just steal millions of dollars from a grieving son." I continued to sip my tea in absolute silence. I let them scream. I let them hurl their pathetic insults and their empty threats at me, while the hidden security cameras mounted in the corners of my living room recorded every single furious word. As I watched Kendrick waving his arms and demanding access to the fraudulent real estate accounts, a massive realization suddenly clicked into place. I remembered the specific liability files I had just reviewed in the Federal Registry. The massive fraudulent loans, the fake property deeds, and the laundered money were not signed by Elijah. The primary signature on every single piece of toxic federal evidence belonged to Kendrick. Elijah had appointed his son as the vice president of the real estate firm 2 years ago. Kendrick thought it was a prestigious title meant to prepare him for leadership. But Elijah had simply used him as a naive and arrogant proxy. Elijah had forged Kendrick's signature on all the massive fraudulent real estate loans. Elijah had deliberately set up his own biological son to take the absolute fall for the federal crimes. Kendrick was standing in my living room completely unaware that he was already the primary target of a massive federal indictment. His father had not left him a massive inheritance. His father had left him a one-way ticket to a maximum security federal prison. He thought he was fighting me for control of a $3 million estate, but he was actually fighting for the legal right to absorb $20 million of federal debt. His father had completely abandoned him, leaving him to face the full, devastating wrath of the United States justice system, while he lived comfortably in absolute luxury on a distant tropical island. I looked at the golden child, realizing he had been completely sacrificed by the very man he worshipped. "Are you even listening to me?" Kendrick shouted, stepping closer to my sofa. "I am calling the sheriff right this second." I slowly placed my porcelain teacup down onto the mahogany saucer. "Go ahead and call them, Kendrick," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. "I am sure the local authorities would be incredibly interested to hear all about your involvement in your father's real estate business." Kendrick frowned, completely confused by my profound lack of fear. Before he could respond, a sharp buzzing sound broke the tension in the room. It was not my primary cell phone. It was a cheap, prepaid burner phone that I'd found hidden inside the bottom drawer of Elijah's desk earlier that morning. I pulled the small black device from the pocket of my cardigan. The screen was brightly illuminated with a new text message from a completely blocked international number. I looked down at the glowing text and my blood ran cold. The message read, "Is it done? Do you have the money?" The message was clearly meant for Elijah. The ghost was actively communicating. The dangerous game was far from over, and I was fully prepared. The following morning, the heavy silence of my affluent neighborhood was violently shattered by the loud grinding gears of a massive commercial moving vehicle. I was sitting at my large granite kitchen island, meticulously reviewing the complex offshore financial routing numbers I had successfully discovered the night before. I looked out the large bay window and saw a gigantic white moving truck backing into my pristine driveway. The passenger door of the truck swung open, and Lauren stepped out wearing a designer tracksuit. Kendrick followed closely behind her, stepping out of his sedan with absolute triumphant arrogance. But they did not come alone to intimidate me. 2 local county sheriff deputies stepped out of a marked patrol cruiser parked right along the curb. Kendrick had clearly used his fake emergency court order and his fabricated last will and testament to convince the local authorities that he was the rightful legal owner of my massive estate. He actually believed his poorly forged documents gave him the ultimate upper hand to forcefully evict me. I watched them march up my front walkway with the deputies trailing behind them. I did not panic. I simply picked up a thick manila folder from my kitchen counter, smoothed my silk blouse, and walked calmly to the front foyer. The heavy brass knocker pounded aggressively against my solid oak door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door wide open. Kendrick stood on my porch with his chest puffed out, clutching a stack of legal papers. The two armed deputies stood right behind him. "Good morning, Vivian," Kendrick announced, his voice loud and incredibly smug. "I told you that you had until Sunday to pack your cheap clothes, but Lauren and I decided we really want to start the massive interior renovations immediately. We have brought a professional moving crew to clear out all of your old depressing furniture. And just in case you decided to be difficult and refused to leave my property, I brought the county sheriffs to officially enforce the legal eviction. You are completely out of time, Vivian." The lead deputy stepped forward and tipped his hat respectfully. "I am very sorry to disturb you, Mom," the deputy said, his voice apologetic but firm. "Mr. Dubois has presented us with a sworn court order and a newly executed will stating he is the sole legal owner of this residence. We are legally required to ask you to vacate the premises and allow the new property owner to take full possession of the estate. If you refuse to comply, we will have no choice but to physically remove you for trespassing." Before I could even offer a single word of response to the polite deputy, Lauren aggressively pushed her way past everyone and barged directly into my beautiful formal foyer. She immediately turned around and started shouting orders to the four large men wearing matching moving company uniforms. "You guys can start right in here," Lauren commanded, waving her manicured hand toward my formal living room. "Grab that hideous mahogany display cabinet first, but be careful not to scratch the hardwood floors on your way out the door. I want all of these heavy antique side tables loaded into the truck immediately, and throw those outdated floral curtains directly into the trash pile." She marched further into my home, acting exactly like a conquering queen, taking absolute possession of her newly acquired luxury castle. I stepped forward and physically blocked the moving crew from crossing the threshold of my front door. "Absolutely nobody is taking a single piece of furniture out of my house," I stated, my voice radiating pure authority. Lauren whipped around and glared at me with absolute fury. She marched right up to the deputies, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "Officers, you need to arrest this woman right now," Lauren demanded, her shrill voice echoing off the high ceilings of my foyer. "She is completely mentally unstable, and she is dangerously delusional. Her husband just died, and she is completely refusing to accept reality. She thinks she still owns this house, but she signed away all her rights months ago. She is nothing but a trespassing squatter who is trying to steal my husband's family legacy. You need to put her in handcuffs and drag her out of my living room before she tries to hurt someone." Kendrick nodded vigorously, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with his entitled wife. "She is completely losing her mind," Officer Kendrick added, trying to sound like a deeply concerned relative. "We are just trying to secure the estate, according to my late father's explicit final wishes. Please, just remove her from the property so we can begin the transition in peace." The lead deputy sighed heavily, clearly hating the messy domestic dispute. He looked at me with an expression of deep pity. "Ma'am, please do not make this any harder than it has to be," the deputy pleaded gently. "I know you are grieving the sudden loss of your husband, but the legal paperwork is completely in order. Mr. Dubois is the executor and the sole heir. You are legally trespassing in this home, and you have to leave right now." I looked at the deputies, at my arrogant stepson, and at his greedy wife, who was already sizing up my expensive crystal chandeliers. I let their absolute entitlement completely fill the room before I finally decided to drop the massive legal hammer I had been quietly holding. "Officers, you have been completely lied to," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. "My husband did not leave this house to his son because my husband never actually owned this house." I opened the thick manila folder I had been holding and pulled out a crisp stack of certified legal documents bound by a heavy golden seal. I handed the official paperwork directly to the lead deputy. "Please review that certified property deed," I instructed smoothly. "I purchased this entire estate entirely with my own money 20 years ago. 5 years ago, I legally transferred absolute ownership of this house into an irrevocable blind trust. I am the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. Elijah's name was never on the original mortgage, and it was certainly never on the deed. He had absolutely zero legal equity in this home at any point in our marriage. Therefore, it is completely physically and legally impossible for him to transfer ownership of this property through a last will and testament or a fake postnuptial agreement. He cannot give away something he never owned. The lead deputy frowned deeply, pulling his reading glasses from his dark uniform pocket. He read through the certified ironclad property deed and the official trust documents. His eyes scanned the raised legal seals and the state verification stamps. The uncomfortable look on his face instantly transformed into a glare of absolute professional anger. He slowly lowered the documents and turned his head to look directly at Kendrick. "Mr. Dubois," the deputy said, his voice suddenly cold and incredibly stern, "this certified deed explicitly proves that your father had absolutely no legal ownership of this estate. The emergency court order you secured is completely invalid regarding this specific property because the underlying assets were severely misrepresented to the judge." Kendrick turned completely pale, his jaw dropping open in absolute shock. "That is impossible," he stammered, taking a step backward. "My father told me this house was the centerpiece of our family legacy. He told me he secured the estate for my future." The deputy handed my documents back to me and rested his hand near his utility belt. "Well, your father completely lied to you," the deputy replied bluntly. "And you have just attempted to use the local sheriff's department to execute an illegal eviction based on fraudulent information. Ma'am is the legal owner of this property, and you are the ones who are currently trespassing. I want you, your wife, and that entire moving crew off this estate immediately before I arrest you for filing a false police report and criminal trespassing." Lauren let out a loud and piercing scream of absolute humiliation. Her face turned a blotchy purple as she realized she was being thrown out of the house she had just claimed as her own. The moving crew did not wait for further instructions. They immediately turned around and sprinted back to their massive truck, slamming the doors and starting the engine. Lauren threw a massive and embarrassing temper tantrum, stomping her expensive designer shoes against the concrete walkway as the deputies physically escorted her and a completely devastated Kendrick off my personal property. They were entirely humiliated in front of my wealthy neighbors. I stood on my front porch watching their luxury sedans speed away in absolute defeat. I smiled softly, feeling completely victorious. But my moment of triumph was violently interrupted when my cell phone began to ring aggressively in my pocket. I quickly answered the phone, and his terrified voice immediately filled my waiting ear. He sounded absolutely panicked and entirely broken. Sister Vivian, the desperate and terrified pastor, gasped, completely out of breath. "You need to come down here to the church right now. Federal agents are swarming the sanctuary and questioning all of the senior deacons. $2 million is completely missing from the Sacred Community Housing Fund. Elijah took everything, and they are threatening to shut the entire church down today." The drive to Mount Calvary Church took exactly 20 minutes, but felt like an absolute eternity. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, processing the frantic phone call I received from Pastor Lewis. $2 million had vanished from the Community Housing Fund, and my late husband was the primary suspect. But I knew Elijah had not acted alone. I pulled into the parking lot of the church and parked my sedan in my reserved spot near the front entrance. The stained glass windows of the sanctuary usually filled me with peace, but today they looked dark and foreboding. I grabbed a thick leather briefcase from my passenger seat. I spent the night compiling financial records, running traces on the offshore shell companies, and printing undeniable federal evidence. I knew exactly what I was walking into. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the church and stepped into the main vestibule. The sanctuary was not empty. The board of senior deacons had been called in for an emergency session, sitting in the front pews, looking like a hostile tribunal. The air in the room was incredibly thick and suffocating. As my heels clicked against the hardwood floor, every head turned to look at me. There were no warm smiles of greeting and no words of sympathy for the grieving widow. There was only cold and profound judgment. Standing next to the wooden pulpit, looking entirely too comfortable, was my arrogant stepson Kendrick. Lauren sat in the first row, wearing a somber black dress, holding a tissue, attempting to look like a concerned family member. Pastor Lewis stood behind the altar, his face drawn and exhausted. Sister Vivian, the pastor, began, his voice echoing across the empty, vaulted ceiling. "We asked you here today because we are facing a catastrophic financial disaster. The $2 million we raised to build the new community housing center has been drained from our bank accounts." The pastor paused, looking down at his hands before meeting my eyes. "Kendrick came to us early this morning and presented some incredibly disturbing information. He claims that you and Elijah secretly planned to embezzle the church funds for months before his tragic boating accident. He told the board you used your extensive background as a tax auditor to help your husband hide the stolen money in offshore accounts. He says you are hoarding the stolen wealth while our beloved church faces financial ruin." I stood in the center aisle listening to the absolute absurdity of their accusations. Kendrick realized the federal authorities were freezing his local accounts, so he decided to preemptively strike against me. He wanted to destroy my reputation in the church and frame me as the criminal mastermind behind his father's theft. He thought he could manipulate the frightened board of deacons into forcing me to surrender my wealth to cover the missing funds. The isolation I felt in that massive sanctuary was incredibly profound. I had dedicated 15 years of my life to this congregation. I cooked meals for the sick, organized charity drives, and generously donated thousands of dollars of my own hard-earned money to support their ministry. Yet the second a greedy man with a loud voice and a fabricated story pointed a finger at me, they instantly turned their backs. Several other church members had filtered into the back pews, drawn by the meeting, and were whispering viciously among themselves. They glared at me with pure hostility, willing to believe the wealthy retired government worker was a heartless thief. Kendrick sensed the shifting mood of the room and seized his opportunity to perform. He slowly walked up the steps to the pulpit, gripping the edges of the wooden podium and bowing his head. He squeezed his eyes shut and forced crocodile tears to roll down his cheeks. "I am so sorry," Pastor Lewis Kendrick cried, his voice cracking with manufactured grief. "I tried to stop her. My father was a good man who loved this church, but Vivian manipulated him. She controlled our family finances and slowly poisoned his mind. She convinced him they needed the church money to secure their own retirement. I begged her to return the funds after my father died, but she completely locked me out of the house and told me I was entirely cut off." Kendrick looked out at the angry deacons and pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is a heartless monster," he shouted, wiping his fake tears. "She used her federal skills to launder the sacred money of this church, and now she is trying to leave me homeless while she lives in luxury." Lauren nodded from the front pew, dabbing her dry eyes and muttering agreement. The board of deacons began to murmur angrily, their collective outrage boiling over. One older deacon stood up and demanded that I be arrested immediately. They were ready to crucify me right there in the center aisle. But I did not scream or cry or desperately beg them to believe my innocence. I stood there completely unbothered by their pathetic display of misplaced righteous anger. I waited until the angry shouting finally died down. Then I walked down the center aisle, my posture perfectly straight and my head held high. I stopped in front of the altar, placing my leather briefcase onto the communion table. I popped the latches open and pulled out a massive stack of detailed financial documents. There were exactly 500 pages of certified audit reports, forensic accounting traces, and official bank transfer logs that I had meticulously compiled overnight. The sheer volume of paperwork landed on the table with a loud, heavy thud that instantly silenced the entire sanctuary. "I do not operate on fake tears," I announced, my voice echoing with the authority of a senior compliance director. "I operate entirely on hard forensic facts." I looked directly at the pastor and the senior deacons. "My husband did steal your $2 million, I stated bluntly, confirming their worst fears. He orchestrated a massive federal real estate fraud, and he absolutely planned to take your money and run. But I did not help him hide a single penny. I spent the entire night tracking exactly where your sacred money went." I pushed the massive stack of audit reports across the wooden table toward Pastor Lewis. "Please open the first folder, Pastor," I instructed smoothly. "Look at the authorized transfer logs from the local commercial bank." The pastor hesitated for a moment before opening the thick folder. His eyes scanned the highlighted sections of the banking documents. The money was transferred into a fraudulent shell company called Apex Holdings. I explained loud enough for the entire room to hear. But my husband did not sign the electronic authorization forms. He used his corporate vice president to execute the massive theft. I turned my head and locked my eyes onto Kendrick, who was still standing at the pulpit. Elijah appointed you as the vice president of his real estate development firm 2 years ago. Kendrick, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous register. Look at the signature on the bottom of those bank transfers, Pastor Lewis. Tell the entire board whose name is signed on the official theft of the community housing funds. Pastor Lewis let out a gasp, reading the signature at the bottom of the banking document. It is Kendrick Dubois, the pastor whispered, trembling with disbelief. He signed the transfers. The board of deacons jumped up, rushing forward to look at the physical evidence on the communion table. They flipped through page after page of fraudulent loan applications, fake property deeds, and offshore routing numbers. Every piece of toxic federal evidence bore the signature of my arrogant stepson. Elijah deliberately set his son up to take the fall for the crimes. Kendrick thought he was executing routine business transactions, but he was actually signing his ticket to a federal prison. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He stumbled backward, his knees shaking violently. That is not true, he stammered, shaking his head. My father told me those were standard investment documents. He told me I was securing the family legacy. I did not steal anything. His protests fell on deaf ears. The deacons turned toward him, their anger transforming into a righteous wrath directed at him. Lauren jumped up from the front pew, realizing her wealthy lifestyle had exploded into a criminal indictment. While the church board closed in on Kendrick, demanding police intervention, I slowly backed away from the altar. I successfully cleared my name and destroyed the stepson who tried to ruin me. As I turned, a sudden movement caught my eye. While everyone was distracted, I noticed a young, beautiful woman slipping quietly out the back doors of the church. She held a designer handbag, looking over her shoulder in absolute panic. I recognized her from the hidden files on my computer. The ghost sent his messenger. I watched the heavy glass doors of the sanctuary swing shut behind the young woman. While the board of deacons completely surrounded my stepson, demanding answers about the stolen $2 million, I quietly slipped out the side exit. I walked quickly across the paved parking lot, my heels clicking sharply against the concrete. I reached my sedan just in time to see a sleek silver sports car speeding out of the church exit. I did not chase her immediately. I simply memorized the license plate number, reciting the letters and numbers in my head, until I was sitting comfortably behind the steering wheel of my own vehicle. I pulled my cell phone from my leather purse and dialed a secure number. During my 35 years with the Internal Revenue Service, I had built an incredibly vast network of trusted federal contacts and law enforcement databases. The man who answered the phone was an old colleague who owed me a massive professional favor. I gave him the license plate number and told him I needed a comprehensive background check completed within the hour. I drove back to my house and poured myself a tall glass of iced water, waiting for the information to arrive. Less than 45 minutes later, an encrypted email appeared on my secure tablet. The silver sports car belonged to a 28-year-old woman named Maya. Her official employment record listed her as a senior real estate assistant at my husband's fraudulent development firm. But the financial data attached to her name told a completely different and far more interesting story. Maya lived in a luxury downtown penthouse apartment that cost $10,000 a month. She drove a car worth over $80,000. Yet her reported taxable income as an assistant was merely $45,000 a year. The math was entirely wrong. It was the exact type of blatant financial discrepancy that I used to flag for immediate federal audits. Elijah was definitely paying for her lavish lifestyle using the stolen funds from his business accounts. He had set her up as his primary mistress. But Maya was not just a naive girl caught in his web. The financial records showed she had recently opened a secure encrypted communication channel and purchased an open-ended international travel visa. She was completely aware that he was faking his death, and she was eagerly waiting for his signal to join him in paradise. She thought she was the beautiful young queen waiting to claim her massive stolen kingdom. I closed the encrypted file and smiled coldly. I needed the digital authenticator keys to his offshore accounts, and I knew exactly how to force her to hand them over. I stood up from my desk and grabbed my car keys. I knew exactly where Maya spent her Sunday afternoons because her credit card statements showed a very predictable and expensive routine. The ghost was communicating, and I was about to intercept the message today. I drove my black sedan to an upscale outdoor cafe located in the wealthiest shopping district of the city. The patio was crowded with wealthy socialites enjoying their expensive weekend brunches. I spotted Maya immediately. She was sitting at a corner table wearing large designer sunglasses and sipping a sparkling mimosa. She looked completely relaxed, entirely unbothered by the massive federal disaster unfolding across town. I walked casually over to her table and sat down in the empty metal chair directly across from her. Maya lowered her sunglasses, her beautiful face instantly contorting into a mask of pure panic. "Mrs. Dubois," she stammered, her voice trembling slightly as she looked around the crowded cafe. "What are you doing here? You really should not be bothering me today. I am just a grieving employee trying to process the tragic loss of my boss. You need to leave me alone before I call the manager to have you removed." I did not move. I folded my hands together and rested them on the pristine white tablecloth. "You are a terrible liar, Maya," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and low. "I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly what you are waiting for right now." Before Maya could formulate another pathetic excuse, I heard a loud and incredibly obnoxious voice behind me. "Well, look who it is," the shrill voice called out. I turned my head slowly and saw Lauren marching toward our table, carrying 4 massive shopping bags from high-end designer boutiques. My entitled daughter-in-law had apparently escaped the total humiliation at the church and decided to soothe her anxiety with a massive shopping spree using credit cards that were about to be permanently frozen. Lauren stood next to our table, placing her hands on her hips and glaring down at me with absolute triumphant arrogance. "Are you seriously harassing this poor girl? Vivian?" Lauren demanded loudly, drawing the attention of several nearby tables. "You are completely out of control. First you tried to steal Kendrick's rightful inheritance, and now you are out here publicly bullying a grieving young woman who simply worked for your husband. You really need to accept that Elijah is dead and move on with your miserable life. Leave her alone, Vivian." Maya looked up at Lauren with a mixture of confusion and profound relief, assuming she had just found an unexpected ally in this situation. I looked at Lauren and felt a deep wave of absolute pity for her blinding ignorance. "Lauren," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, "you have absolutely no idea what is happening around you. You are standing on a massive financial landmine, and you are eagerly jumping up and down. I suggest you take your shopping bags and go home before the federal agents come to repossess those expensive shoes." Lauren scoffed loudly, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "You are completely insane," she snapped, turning on her heel and strutting away. I turned my attention immediately back to Maya, who was now nervously gripping the stem of her mimosa glass. "Lauren is completely oblivious to the real world," I said, leaning closer to the terrified young woman. "But you and I both know the absolute truth, Maya. I know you are Elijah's mistress." Maya opened her mouth to aggressively deny the accusation, but I raised my hand to silence her. "Do not waste my time playing the innocent victim," I warned her smoothly. "I spent the morning pulling your complete financial history. I know about the downtown luxury penthouse my husband pays for using a dummy corporate account. I know about the $80,000 silver sports car registered under a fake limited liability company. And most importantly, I know about the secure encrypted communication app you installed on your phone yesterday morning to receive messages from a dead man." Maya turned a sickly shade of pale, her hands shaking so violently she had to place her glass back onto the table. The cocky and relaxed demeanor she had displayed just 5 minutes ago completely evaporated. "How do you know all of this?" she whispered, her eyes darting around the cafe as if she expected federal agents to jump out of the surrounding bushes. "I know everything because I am a retired senior compliance director for the federal government," I explained, watching the pure terror completely wash over her face. Elijah thought he was a criminal mastermind, but he left a massive paper trail leading directly to your doorstep. You are actively aiding and abetting a fugitive Maya. You are harboring stolen federal funds and conspiring to commit massive wire fraud. When the Department of Justice officially files the massive real estate indictment, they are going to arrest you right alongside him. You are going to spend the best decades of your young life rotting inside a federal prison cell. Maya began to hyperventilate, tears springing to her beautiful eyes. "No," she cried softly, shaking her head in complete denial. "He promised me we were going to be completely safe. He said he had the $5 million securely locked in the offshore Apex Holdings account. He told me to wait here until he finalized the tropical property purchases. He is going to send for me on Friday, and we are going to start a brand new life together. He loves me, Vivian. He chose me over you." I listened to her pathetic confession, feeling a cold and ruthless satisfaction. She had just confirmed the exact name of the offshore shell company and admitted she had direct contact with him. I reached into my leather purse and pulled out a single glossy photograph. I slid the photograph across the white tablecloth. The picture showed Elijah very much alive, boarding a private charter plane to Belize. He had his arm wrapped tightly around a stunning brunette woman. A third woman. Maya stared at the photo, realizing she was a decoy. Maya stared at the glossy photograph resting on the white tablecloth, her eyes locked onto the image of Elijah with another woman. The confident facade she had maintained just moments earlier completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces as the harsh reality of her situation became undeniably clear. Her hands began to shake violently as she picked up the picture, bringing it closer to her face, as if a closer look might somehow change the devastating reality of what she was seeing. "He told me she was just a travel agent," Maya whispered, her voice cracking with profound betrayal. "He told me he needed her to handle the international flight logistics and the customs paperwork so we could remain completely undetected. He swore to me that I was the only woman he truly loved and that we were going to spend the rest of our lives walking on white sand beaches." I sat back in my metal chair and watched her entire world completely collapse right in front of my eyes, and I felt absolutely no sympathy for her. She was a grown 28-year-old woman who had knowingly participated in a massive criminal conspiracy and happily spent stolen money to elevate her own social status. She had willingly helped a married man hide his assets, and she fully intended to live a life of luxury funded by his massive fraud. But her profound ignorance was about to cost her everything. I reached into my leather purse and pulled out a second stack of documents. I placed the manila folder over the photograph, forcing her to look at the financial reality. "Open the folder, Maya," I instructed, my voice completely detached. "You need to see exactly what your beloved Elijah actually left behind for you before he boarded that expensive private plane." Maya hesitated for a brief moment before her trembling fingers opened the cover. She stared down at the highlighted banking records and the corporate filings I had spent the morning pulling from secure federal servers. "These are the internal accounting logs for your luxury downtown penthouse and your expensive silver sports car," I explained, pointing to the highlighted sections of the document. "Do you see the primary name listed on the corporate liability agreements? Elijah did not purchase those expensive assets in his own name. He registered the dummy corporation entirely under your social security number and your personal signature. And what is even worse, he linked those specific corporate accounts directly to the fraudulent real estate development loans. The local federal prosecutors have been building a massive case against his firm for the past 2 years. When the Department of Justice officially unseals their massive indictment next week, they are not going to be looking for a dead man. They are going to trace the stolen money directly to the corporate entity registered in your name. He did not leave you behind to wait for his romantic signal, Maya. He left you behind to serve as the perfect scapegoat. He set you up to take the absolute fall for his local fraud charges so he could completely escape federal prison." Maya gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her hand, as the horrifying truth finally washed over her. She was completely trapped. Tears streamed rapidly down her flawless cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup and dripping onto the white tablecloth. She sobbed into her hands, realizing the wealthy older man she thought would rescue her had actually pushed her directly into the path of a freight train. "What am I supposed to do?" she cried out desperately, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes, pleading for a miraculous solution. "I do not have the money to hire a high-powered federal defense attorney. If the federal agents arrest me, I will spend the rest of my life behind bars. Please, Mrs. Dubois, you have to help me. You worked for the government. You know how to fix this." I looked at the sobbing young woman sitting across the small cafe table from me, and I absolutely refused to offer her a single ounce of maternal comfort. I was not her savior, and I was definitely not her friend. I am not here to help you out of the goodness of my heart. "Maya," I stated bluntly, my voice completely devoid of warmth. "I am here to offer you a simple business transaction. You are currently holding the digital authenticator keys for the offshore shell company called Apex Holdings. I know Elijah left them in your possession because he needed a trusted local proxy to initiate the final transfer protocols once he safely arrived in Belize. He planned to call you later today to confirm the account was secure before he cut off communication and completely abandoned you to the federal authorities." Maya nodded slowly, wiping her tears with a silk napkin. "He gave me a secure, encrypted flash drive and a digital passcode," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "He told me to keep it hidden until he sent the specific message." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "Here is my offer," I said, lowering my voice so nobody at the surrounding tables could hear our conversation. "You are going to slide that encrypted flash drive and the digital passcode across this table right now. You are going to surrender complete and total control of the $5 million to me. In exchange, I will permanently delete your name from the financial evidence files before I hand the massive federal real estate fraud case over to my contacts at the Department of Justice. You will walk away from this cafe with your absolute freedom. You will pack your bags, leave this city tonight, and never look back. If you refuse to give me the keys, I will immediately call the Federal Bureau of Investigation and hand them your complete financial history. You will be arrested before you can even walk out of this shopping district. The choice is entirely yours to make right here and right now." Maya stared at me, realizing she had absolutely no leverage and no alternative. I was her only way out. She reached deeply into her expensive designer handbag with violently trembling fingers and pulled out a small black velvet pouch. She placed it on the white tablecloth and slowly pushed it across the surface toward me. I unfastened the top of the pouch and tipped it over. A small, silver encrypted flash drive fell onto the table, followed by a folded piece of thick white paper containing a long sequence of complex alphanumeric passwords. I picked up the silver device and the paper, safely securing both items inside my deep leather purse. I had successfully retrieved the keys to the kingdom. I now possessed complete and absolute control over the massive $5 million offshore account. The ghost was now completely broke, and he had absolutely no idea. Maya stood up from her chair, her legs shaking visibly. She did not say another word to me. She simply grabbed her handbag and practically sprinted away from the cafe patio, disappearing quickly into the busy afternoon crowd. I sat at the table for a few more minutes, finishing my water and enjoying the sunshine. I had neutralized the mistress, secured the stolen money, and gathered the necessary evidence to destroy my arrogant stepson. The massive and complex financial web my husband had woven was now entirely in my hands. I paid the bill and walked back to my sedan, feeling an incredible sense of absolute victory. But while I was sitting comfortably at the upscale cafe methodically dismantling Elijah's grand plan, the absolute chaos he left behind was violently erupting at my house. Kendrick had been completely humiliated by the sheriff deputies and publicly destroyed by the church board of deacons. He was currently drowning in a sea of massive debt and terrifying federal exposure. He knew the federal authorities were preparing to freeze his remaining assets, and the dangerous loan sharks who had funded his luxury car dealership were actively hunting him down. He was completely out of time and driven by a dark and dangerous desperation. He believed that if he could simply find the original life insurance policy inside my house, he could somehow force the insurance company to release the funds. He waited until he was absolutely certain, I was not at home. He drove his sedan to the quiet street behind my property and parked in the shadows. Kendrick walked through the dense woods, gripping a heavy metal tire iron in his sweating hands. He approached the back of my large brick home, completely consumed by his own terrifying panic. He raised the heavy metal bar and violently smashed the glass panel of my back patio door, shattering the fragile barrier into 1,000 pieces. He reached through the broken glass, unlocked the heavy deadbolt, and stepped inside my quiet house. He was frantically searching for the money, but he was actually walking directly into his ultimate doom. I drove my sedan up the long driveway as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the tree line. The meeting with Maya had been an absolute triumph, and I felt an incredible sense of control with the digital keys to the offshore account safely hidden inside my purse. But the quiet tranquility of my property was broken the moment I pulled into the garage. I walked up the stone steps to my patio and stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy glass pane of my custom back door had been shattered into jagged pieces across the imported tiles. Someone had violently broken into my home in broad daylight. I did not panic and I did not scream. 35 years of working dangerous tax evasion cases had trained my nervous system to remain entirely calm under pressure. I reached into my purse and kept my hand securely wrapped around my cell phone. I stepped carefully over the broken glass and entered the quiet kitchen. The house felt unnervingly still, but then I heard the distinct sound of heavy furniture being dragged across the hardwood floors. The noise was coming directly from my private home office. I walked silently down the corridor, my soft shoes making absolutely no sound. I stopped at the doorway of my office and looked inside at the absolute destruction. The room looked like a hurricane had ripped right through it. My mahogany filing cabinets were overturned, and hundreds of private documents were scattered wildly across the Persian rug. The drawers of my antique desk had been violently pulled out and smashed onto the floor. Standing in the center of the total wreckage was my stepson Kendrick. He looked absolutely deranged. His designer suit was ruined, covered in dirt and nervous sweat. He was breathing heavily, ripping books off the shelves and throwing them across the room. He was frantically searching for the original life insurance policies he desperately needed to save his own miserable life. He had completely lost his mind. I stood in the doorway watching him destroy my sanctuary. I pressed a specific button sequence on my cell phone, activating the silent security alarm that routed directly to the local police precinct. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and cleared my throat loudly. Kendrick whipped his head around, his eyes wide and bloodshot, staring at me like a trapped animal caught completely off guard. He froze, dropping a stack of my tax records onto the floor. "You have exactly 1 minute to explain why you are destroying my home before you spend the rest of the decade behind bars," I said, my voice completely cold and entirely unbothered. Kendrick did not try to run away. Instead, his terror completely morphed into a dark and explosive rage. He aggressively kicked a wooden drawer out of his way and marched toward me. "You have to give me the life insurance documents right now, Vivian," he demanded, his voice cracking with pure desperation. The bank completely froze my accounts, and the local loan sharks are actively hunting me down. They threaten to kill me if I do not pay them back by tomorrow morning. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a dirty hand. "And it gets even worse," he continued, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. "The federal agents raided the church after you left, and they are building a massive criminal case against me. They actually think I stole the $2 million housing fund. They are trying to frame me for my father's business decisions. You have the money, Vivian. You have the millions from the life insurance, and you have to bail me out. You are my stepmother, and you owe this to my father. He loved me, and he wanted me to inherit the legacy he built." I listened to his frantic screaming and felt absolute pity for his blinding ignorance. He truly believed his father was a generous patriarch who loved him unconditionally. He thought Elijah had simply made some bad investments and left him in charge of fixing the temporary mess. Kendrick could not fathom the reality that his beloved father was a complete monster. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. "You are incredibly delusional, Kendrick," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. "Your father did not love you, and he certainly did not leave a legacy for you to protect. He left you with $20 million of toxic federal debt and a one-way ticket to a maximum security prison. Kendrick shook his head violently, refusing to accept reality. "That is a complete lie," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "My father trusted me. He made me the vice president of the company because he believed in my vision. He wanted me to succeed. He would never do anything to hurt me. You are just a bitter old woman who wants to steal the money he left for his real family. Give me the insurance papers, or I swear I will tear this house apart until I find them." He took a threatening step closer, clenching his fists at his sides. He thought he could use physical intimidation to force my compliance, but he drastically underestimated the woman he was dealing with. I did not flinch or back away. I simply walked past him, stepping over the broken furniture, and walked directly to my heavy steel floor safe hidden behind the oak desk. I knelt down and spun the combination dial, unlocking the heavy metal door. I did not pull out the life insurance policy. Instead, I pulled out the crisp stack of financial documents and the offshore routing traces I had printed that morning. I stood back up and dropped the heavy stack of papers directly onto the top of my ruined mahogany desk. "You want the absolute truth about your father, Kendrick," I said. "Come read exactly what his love actually looks like." Kendrick hesitated before slowly walking over to the desk. He looked down at the highlighted banking records and corporate filings. "These are the internal accounting logs for a fraudulent shell company located in the Cayman Islands," I explained. "The company is completely untraceable, but I found the specific routing numbers. Do you want to know what is sitting inside that offshore account right now, Kendrick? $5 million. The exact amount of your father's massive life insurance payout. The money is completely gone. It was wired out of the country the very same day your father supposedly drowned in that tragic boating accident." Kendrick stared at the papers, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "That is impossible," he stammered, his eyes scanning the undeniable federal evidence. "He is dead. The insurance company would not pay out to a dead man." I let out a sharp and cold laugh. "He is not dead, Kendrick," I stated bluntly. "Your father faked his own death because the Department of Justice is preparing to unseal a massive federal indictment against his real estate firm next week. He knew he was facing 30 years in federal prison, so he staged an accident, stole the insurance money, and completely disappeared into the wind. And do you want to know the absolute worst part?" I pointed directly at the signature lines on the fraudulent loan applications. "He did not sign a single piece of the toxic federal evidence. He made you the corporate vice president so you would sign the documents for him. He deliberately set you up to take the absolute fall for the massive real estate fraud and the stolen church funds. He left you completely alone to face the federal authorities and the violent loan sharks while he flew away on a private jet to live on a tropical beach. He completely sacrificed your entire life to save his own skin." Kendrick gasped loudly, covering his mouth with his hands, as the horrifying truth finally washed over his arrogant brain. The golden child realized he was nothing more than a disposable pawn in his father's incredibly wicked game. The man he idolized and worshipped had actively plotted his total destruction. He fell to his knees on the Persian rug, completely surrounded by the wreckage he had caused. "No!" he cried out softly, shaking his head in complete denial. "He would not do this to me. I am his only son. He loves me. He would not leave me here to rot in prison." He sobbed into his dirty hands, completely broken by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. I stood over him, feeling absolutely no remorse. "I warned you about your father years ago, Kendrick," I reminded him coldly. "But you were too busy spending my money and disrespecting my home to listen to the truth. Now you get to pay his debts." The absolute finality in my voice caused something inside Kendrick to completely snap. His profound sorrow instantly transformed into a dark and violent rage. He realized his life was completely over, and he blamed me for exposing the painful truth. "You ruined everything," he screamed at the top of his lungs, his face contorting into a mask of pure hatred. He jumped up from the floor, his eyes completely wild and deranged. He lunged across the room, grabbing my shoulders with his heavy hands and shoving me violently against the wooden doorframe. He raised his fist, preparing to strike me down in his desperate fury. But before he could even swing his arm, the dark room was suddenly flooded with bright flashing lights. Intense beams of red and blue illuminated the living room windows, casting long moving shadows across the destroyed office. The loud and aggressive wail of multiple police sirens completely surrounded my entire estate. The heavy tires of police cruisers screeched to a halt on my front driveway, and heavy boots pounded against my front porch. I looked at Kendrick, whose face was now frozen in absolute terror as he realized the police were already here. I hit the silent alarm the exact moment I walked into the house. I whispered coldly into his ear, "You are entirely out of time." The heavy pounding on my front door echoed violently through the long hallway before it was immediately followed by the deafening crash of a battering ram. The local police department did not politely wait for anyone to answer. They swarmed into my formal living room with their weapons drawn and their tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness of the house. Kendrick completely froze, dropping his hands from my shoulders and backing away from me as if I had suddenly caught fire. He stumbled over the scattered tax records on the floor, his expensive designer shoes slipping on the scattered papers. 4 armed police officers rushed into my destroyed home office, shouting strict commands for him to get down on the floor. Kendrick raised his trembling hands high above his head, his arrogant chest heaving with absolute terror. He dropped heavily to his knees, completely surrendering without a single fight as the officers grabbed his arms and forced him flat against my expensive Persian rug. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists sounded like the absolute end of his entire world. The lead officer, a tall and broad-shouldered man, pulled Kendrick roughly upright today. Kendrick Dubois, the officer announced, his loud voice ringing with absolute authority. "You are under arrest for felony, breaking and entering malicious destruction of private property, and aggravated assault. Furthermore, we are officially executing multiple outstanding federal warrants issued just an hour ago by the Department of Justice. You are being federally indicted for massive wire fraud, money laundering, and the direct embezzlement of $2 million from the Mount Calvary Church Community Housing Fund." Kendrick completely lost his mind, thrashing weakly against the strong grip of the police officers and shaking his head in absolute frantic denial today completely. "No!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "I did not steal the church money. My father did it, and he set me up to take the fall. You have the wrong man, so you need to arrest my stepmother because she knows exactly where the money is hidden." He turned his panicked face toward me, his eyes wide and completely bloodshot, pleading for a miraculous intervention. "Tell them, Vivian," he begged, sobbing uncontrollably as the officers began to drag him out of the room. "Tell them I am completely innocent. Tell them my father faked his own death." I stood perfectly still, smoothing the wrinkles from my silk blouse, and I looked at the golden child, completely broken and humiliated. I felt absolutely no sympathy for his pathetic tears, and I did not say a single word to defend him. I simply watched the officers drag him down my hallway and out the front door. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated his terrified face one last time before they shoved him into the back of a waiting police cruiser. I took a deep breath outside, feeling an incredible sense of absolute victory over his foolish greed tonight. 2 hours later, I walked into the cold and sterile environment of the downtown police precinct, holding my thick leather briefcase. I was escorted directly to a small windowless interrogation room where Detective Hayes was waiting patiently for my arrival. Detective Hayes was a sharp and seasoned investigator who had been actively working the church fraud case all afternoon. He pulled out a metal chair for me, and I sat down, placing my briefcase onto the scratched metal table. "Thank you for coming down so quickly, Mrs. Dubois," the detective said, his tone deeply respectful and entirely professional here today. I opened the brass latches of my briefcase and pulled out the massive stack of original documents I had meticulously collected. "I am here to provide the federal prosecutors with everything they need to secure a permanent conviction," I stated calmly. I slid the dark blue folder containing the fabricated last will and testament across the metal table. "This document was presented to me yesterday morning by Kendrick and his sleazy attorney," I explained smoothly. "It is a complete and blatant forgery designed to steal my entire $3 million estate and disinherit me from my own acquired property forever. Detective Hayes opened the blue folder and examined the fraudulent signatures with a highly trained professional eye. But the deep criminal conspiracy does not stop there, Detective. I continued sliding a second manila folder across the table. Inside that folder, you will find the fake post-nuptial agreement and the falsified property deeds Kendrick attempted to use to forcefully evict me from my home. Furthermore, I have included the official forensic audit reports proving that every single stolen dollar from the Mount Calvary Church was authorized and executed using the direct personal digital signature of my highly arrogant stepson Kendrick today. Detective Hayes reviewed the undeniable physical evidence, his expression shifting from serious concentration to absolute undeniable shock. "You have successfully handed us an entirely airtight criminal case, Mrs. Dubois," the detective murmured, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. He tried to claim his father forced him to sign those specific banking documents, but this level of documented fraud carries a minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. "Kendrick Dubois is going away for a very long time." I nodded slowly, feeling a cold and ruthless satisfaction wash over my entire body as I legally buried him forever here. "Would you like to speak with him before we transport him to the federal holding facility?" Detective Hayes asked gently. I stood up from the metal chair and smoothed my dark trousers, nodding my head in silent agreement. The detective led me down a narrow concrete hallway, stopping in front of a heavy steel door equipped with a thick, one-way observation mirror. I looked through the heavily smudged glass and saw Kendrick sitting completely alone inside a cramped holding cell. His ruined designer suit was covered in dirt, and his hands were shackled securely to the metal table inside. Detective Hayes opened the heavy door, and I stepped quietly into the freezing cell, keeping my distance from the metal table. Kendrick slowly raised his head, his face completely stained with bitter tears and deep regret. "Vivian," he whispered, his voice hoarse and entirely broken, "you have to help me get out of here. Please tell them the truth about my father. Tell them he faked the boating accident and escaped to the Cayman Islands. I am begging you, Vivian. I will do anything you want if you just hire a lawyer and help me fight these massive criminal charges." I looked down at the pathetic man who had marched into my church just hours ago and publicly accused me of a massive federal crime. I looked at the entitled stepson who had brought armed sheriffs to my personal property to throw me out onto the street. "You wanted to be the man of the house, Kendrick?" I replied, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or mercy. "You wanted to take absolute control of the Dubois family legacy and proudly step into your father's incredibly large shoes. Well, you finally got exactly what you desperately asked for today entirely. I warned you about your father years ago. Kendrick," I continued, leaning slightly closer so he could hear every single cold syllable, "I told you he was a liar and a completely selfish predator, but you chose to disrespect me and worship him instead. He left you with $20 million of toxic debt and a massive federal indictment. Now you can pay his debts completely by yourself." I turned my back to him, ignoring his frantic and desperate pleas for mercy. I walked out of the freezing holding cell and let the heavy steel door slam completely shut forever. Kendrick screamed my name through the thick observation glass, slamming his shackled hands violently against the metal table in sheer terror. I did not look back at him even once as I confidently walked down the concrete hallway toward the main precinct exit. I had successfully eliminated the first massive threat to my hard-earned empire and completely neutralized the Golden Child. But the chaotic fallout of Kendrick's devastating federal arrest was already spreading rapidly across the wealthy suburbs like a massive, uncontrollable wildfire today. The news of the massive church fraud had finally reached the exclusive local country club. Lauren had been sitting by the country club pool, sipping expensive champagne, when her cell phone suddenly exploded with panicked text messages. She read the horrifying news about her husband's federal arrest and the massive asset seizures, and her face turned a sickly shade of white. She realized her entire luxurious lifestyle was completely evaporating right before her eyes. Driven by pure selfish desperation, Lauren immediately dropped her crystal glass, grabbed her designer handbag, and rushed toward her luxury car. She desperately planned to quickly drain all their joint bank accounts and immediately flee the state before midnight arrives tonight. The news of Kendrick's federal arrest spread through the wealthy suburbs like a wildfire. Lauren drove to the exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club the moment she realized her bank accounts were frozen by federal authorities. She sat on the patio surrounded by manicured golf courses and white linen tables. She desperately tried to maintain her social facade while her entire world violently collapsed. Lauren sat at a prime table surrounded by 4 wealthy white friends wearing tennis skirts and sipping sparkling water. She leaned forward, gripping her crystal glass, and forced a bright artificial smile. "It is honestly just a massive misunderstanding," Lauren lied, her shrill voice echoing across the patio. "Kendrick is dealing with a minor tax mix-up regarding his dealership and his father's estate. The federal agents are overreacting because they do not understand complex accounting procedures." She took a nervous sip, looking at the skeptical faces of her friends. "We just need a temporary bridge loan to cover the legal retainer fees," Lauren continued, her voice dripping with desperation. "I promise we will pay you back with massive interest the second the bank unlocks our accounts. You know Kendrick is a brilliant businessman, and we are good for the money." Her friends exchanged uncomfortable glances, shifting awkwardly in their wicker chairs. They had all seen the breaking news reports on their smartphones minutes earlier. They knew exactly what Kendrick was facing, and they absolutely refused to hand over a single penny to a woman whose husband was actively sitting in a federal holding cell for stealing millions from a local church. Lauren felt the heavy silence suffocating her. She realized her social circle was completely abandoning her in her darkest hour. She opened her mouth to beg them, but her desperate words died in her throat. She stared across the manicured lawn, entirely unable to process the terrifying reality walking directly toward her. The warm sun cast a bright glow over the dining area, but Lauren felt a sudden freezing chill wash over her body. She realized her pathetic lies were about to be completely destroyed. I walked through the grand entrance of the club wearing a perfectly tailored emerald green suit. The glass doors were held wide open for me by the respectful club management staff. Lauren always assumed I did not belong in these exclusive spaces because I refused to waste my wealth on frivolous social memberships. She completely failed to realize that, as a retired senior compliance director, I possessed powerful professional connections with the elite politicians who actually own the club. I was not sneaking onto the property. I was walking across the pristine patio as a personally invited VIP guest. My heels clicked softly against the stone pathway, drawing the immediate attention of every single patron sitting in the dining area. The busy waiters stopped pouring champagne, and the affluent guests lowered their crystal glasses to watch my undeniable approach. I moved with the terrifying authority of a woman who held absolute power over the entire situation. I spotted Lauren sitting at her table looking like a terrified animal caught entirely in the headlights. Her wealthy friends turned to look at me, their eyes widening in absolute shock as they recognized the wealthy widow they had been gossiping about. I walked right up to their white linen table and stopped completely still. I did not raise my voice or cause a public scene. I simply let my overwhelming presence completely crush Lauren's artificial confidence into tiny pieces. "Hello, Lauren," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any warmth. "I hear you are asking your wealthy friends for a cash loan to save your criminal husband from a federal prison sentence." Lauren turned a sickly shade of pale, her jaw dropping open in absolute sheer terror. "What are you doing here?" "Vivian," Lauren demanded, her voice cracking with pure panic, "this is a private club and you are completely trespassing. You need to leave right now before I call the security guards to have you dragged off the property." I looked down at her and let out an incredibly cold laugh. "You do not have the power to kick anyone out of this club, Lauren," I replied. "In fact, you do not have the power to do anything anymore. You thought you could simply drain your joint bank accounts and flee the state while Kendrick took the fall for the church fraud. You thought your elite social status would protect you from the devastating consequences of your greedy choices. You were completely and fatally wrong. I reached my hand inside my expensive leather handbag and securely grasped a stack of highly sensitive federal documents. I was fully prepared to execute the final phase of her total destruction right in front of her prestigious peers. I pulled the crisp white documents from my bag and tossed them directly onto the center of the white linen table next to her sparkling water. The papers landed with a soft thud that sounded like a massive explosion in the terrifying silence of the patio. Lauren's wealthy friends immediately leaned forward, their eyes scanning the bold black federal text printed across the top of the pages. "What is this?" Lauren whispered, her entire body shaking violently as she stared at the federal paperwork. "Those are official Internal Revenue Service asset seizure notices," I explained, my voice ringing clearly across the dining area so every elite guest could hear the absolute truth. "The federal government is seizing your luxury vehicles, your massive bank accounts, your expensive diamond jewelry, and your highly prestigious country club membership today." Lauren gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her manicured hands as the horrifying reality finally washed over her arrogant brain. "You see, Lauren," I continued, leaning closer to her terrified face, "you made one incredibly massive and completely fatal mistake. When Kendrick desperately needed money to fund his failing luxury car dealership, he could not secure the business loans on his own because his credit was entirely ruined. So he convinced his incredibly naive and greedy wife to legally co-sign every single one of those massive fraudulent federal loans. You legally attached your own personal name to millions of dollars of incredibly toxic federal debt. You are absolutely liable for every single stolen dollar your husband currently owes the United States government." The wealthy women sitting at the table instantly jumped up from their wicker chairs, grabbing their expensive designer purses and backing away from Lauren as if she was infected with a contagious disease. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a woman being targeted by the federal tax authorities. "You cannot do this to me!" Lauren screamed at the top of her lungs, her face contorting into a mask of complete public humiliation. "I am completely innocent, and I did not know anything about the stolen church money or the fake real estate loans. I am just a victim of his terrible business choices. You are completely ruining my entire life, Vivian." I looked down at her crying face and felt absolutely no pity for her sudden poverty. "You ruined your own life the exact moment you walked into my church and demanded the keys to my personal estate," I reminded her coldly. "You tried to throw me out of my own home, and now the federal government is throwing you out of your entire luxurious life." The country club general manager, flanked by 2 large security guards, quickly marched across the stone patio. He looked down at Lauren with an expression of profound professional disgust. "Mrs. Dubois," the manager announced, his voice incredibly stern, "your exclusive club membership has been officially and permanently revoked by federal order. I must ask you to collect your belongings and vacate these private premises immediately." Lauren sobbed uncontrollably, her expensive mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She grabbed her designer handbag and stumbled away from the table, completely destroyed and entirely humiliated in front of the local elite. The security guards grabbed her arms and aggressively escorted her across the manicured green lawn and directly out of the country club forever. I stood by the table watching her pathetic departure and feeling an incredible sense of absolute victory. I had successfully dismantled the greedy heirs and completely protected my massive financial empire from their incredibly toxic grasp. I turned around, preparing to walk off the beautiful patio and enjoy the rest of my peaceful afternoon. But before I could take a single step forward, a sharp buzzing sound suddenly vibrated deep inside my tailored suit pocket. It was not my primary cell phone ringing. It was the cheap, prepaid burner phone I had successfully retrieved from Elijah's hidden desk drawer earlier that morning. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out the small black device. The bright screen illuminated, displaying an incoming voice call from a completely blocked international number. The terrifying ghost was finally calling. I held the small black burner phone in the palm of my hand, staring at the glowing screen as it vibrated continuously against my skin. The bright display indicated an incoming voice call from a completely blocked international number. I tuned out the ambient noise of the wealthy socialites. I turned my back to the manicured green lawn and walked slowly toward a secluded stone pathway lined with tall, blooming hydrangea bushes. I needed absolute privacy for this specific conversation. My heart beat with a completely steady and incredibly calm rhythm. I was a retired senior compliance director about to negotiate directly with a fugitive ghost. I pressed the green button on the screen and brought the cheap plastic device up to my ear. I did not say a single word. I simply stood in the warm afternoon sunlight and listened closely to the heavy static of the international connection. For a brief second, there was only distant wind and electronic interference. Then a highly familiar and deeply frantic voice broke through the silence. It was my late husband, Elijah. Maya, he barked, his voice laced with absolute panic and pure toxic aggression. Maya, pick up the phone right now and tell me exactly what the hell is going on. I told you to wait for my specific signal before you touch the encrypted flash drive. Why is the Apex Holdings account completely locked out? I tried to initiate the final offshore wire transfer to finalize the purchase of the luxury beachfront villa, but the bank portal completely rejected my administrative credentials. He was breathing heavily, his words rushing in a terrified stream of consciousness. You promised to keep the authenticator keys perfectly safe until I called, he yelled. Did you mess up the password sequence? Did you try to log into the system early and trigger a security freeze? You need to call the offshore broker immediately and verify my identity so they can unlock my $5 million. I am completely stranded out here with absolutely no access to my liquid capital. If you ruin this for me, Maya, I swear I will make you deeply regret it. Just fix the problem and wire the money to the secondary dummy corporation before the federal authorities realize what is happening. Please, Maya, just tell me you did not lose my massive fortune. I stood perfectly still on the stone pathway, listening to the pathetic panic of a man who thought he had successfully outsmarted the entire United States government. He was completely terrified and entirely dependent on a naive young mistress who had already surrendered everything to save her own skin. He had absolutely no idea that his massive criminal empire had already completely collapsed around him. The ghost was desperately crying out from his fake grave, begging for his stolen millions. I took a deep, slow breath, enjoying the sheer magnitude of my total victory, before I finally decided to break my silence. I kept the phone pressed against my ear, listening to him frantically pace on the other end. "Hello, Elijah?" I said, my voice perfectly smooth and completely devoid of any emotional warmth. The weather in Belize must be absolutely beautiful this time of year. The line went completely dead silent. The heavy static continued to hum softly in the background, but Elijah completely stopped breathing. I could physically feel his absolute sheer terror radiating through the international cellular connection. The arrogant developer finally realized he was speaking directly to the wife he tried to completely destroy. "Vivian," he whispered, his voice cracking with profound shock and horrifying realization. "How did you get this phone number? Where is Maya? What did you do to her?" I smiled coldly, looking out over the pristine golf course. "Maya is currently packing her designer bags and running far away from your federal indictment," I explained calmly. "She eagerly traded your authenticator keys for her personal freedom. I showed her exactly how you plan to leave her completely liable for the local fraud charges, and she instantly abandoned your tropical fantasy. You are a terrible judge of character, Elijah. You truly thought you could trust a greedy 28-year-old girl to protect a $5 million stolen fortune." He let out a strange, choking sound, completely unable to process the absolute magnitude of his catastrophic failure. "You hacked my private computer," he stammered desperately, trying to comprehend my counterattack. "I did not just trace the shell company, Elijah," I corrected him, my tone dropping dangerously. "I completely dismantled it. I spent 35 years at the Internal Revenue Service tearing apart complex offshore trusts. Did you honestly believe a sloppy real estate developer with a fake post-nuptial agreement could successfully hide a massive life insurance payout from a senior federal compliance director?" You left financial evidence so incredibly wide that I found your secret accounts before they even buried your empty wooden coffin this morning. You tried to fake your own death and leave me to face the federal investigators and your angry creditors alone. You wanted me to lose my home and my pristine reputation while you sipped expensive cocktails on a white sand beach, but you drastically underestimated my intelligence and you fatally miscalculated my absolute resilience. Elijah began panicking, sputtering pathetic excuses and desperate lies. Vivian, please listen to me. He begged, his facade completely shattering. The federal agents were closing in on my business and I panicked. I never meant to hurt you. I was going to send you a portion of the money once things cooled down. I swear I was trying to protect you from the massive fallout. I did not let him finish his pathetic string of fabricated garbage. You deliberately set up your son Kendrick to take the fall for your crimes, I stated bluntly. He is sitting in a federal holding cell right now because you forged his signature on all the toxic loans. You destroyed your own biological child just to save yourself. Elijah realized his pathetic lies were completely useless, and his desperation instantly transformed into dark, vicious hostility. You listen carefully, Vivian, he growled, his voice dropping into a deep, threatening register. You do not know who you are dealing with anymore. I have powerful and incredibly dangerous connections down here. I can easily hire hitmen who will gladly show up at your house in the middle of the night. If you do not unlock my account and transfer my $5 million right now, you will not live to see the end of the week. I stood in the warm sunshine and let out a loud, genuine laugh that echoed brightly across the stone pathway. Your empty threats are incredibly amusing, Elijah, I replied, unbothered by his pathetic intimidation. You cannot afford to hire a hitman because you do not have a single penny left. While you were sitting on your charter plane assuming you completely won the game, I used the keys Maya handed me. I completely bypassed the offshore banking protocols and legally seized the entire $5 million balance. But I did not keep the money for myself. I securely rerouted every stolen dollar directly into a heavily restricted Internal Revenue Service federal holding account. The United States government officially possesses your stolen fortune, and there is absolutely nothing you can do. The silence on the phone was absolutely deafening. Elijah finally realized he was a dead man walking with exactly $0 in his pocket. He was completely broke, stranded in a foreign country, and actively hunted by the federal justice system. You have absolutely nothing left, Elijah. I continued, my voice hard and incredibly ruthless. But you do have one massive remaining problem. I dug deeply into the startup capital you used to fund your fake real estate firm. You did not borrow that initial money from a legitimate commercial bank. You borrowed $2 million from a violent Belizean cartel and used the church funds to pay the interest. Now that your accounts are frozen and you are hiding in their backyard, they will find you quickly. Elijah began to loudly hyperventilate, crying and begging for his miserable life. What do you want from me, Vivian? He sobbed, completely broken and utterly defeated. I will do absolutely whatever you want. Here is my final ultimatum. I announced, my voice echoing with absolute cold authority. You are going to book a commercial flight and come back to this city immediately. You will walk into my attorney's office tomorrow afternoon and physically sign the divorce papers and the total asset surrender documents in person. You will legally completely relinquish any claim to my personal estate. If you refuse to show up or if you try to run away again, I will personally send your exact GPS coordinates and your current hotel room number directly to the Belizean cartel leadership. The choice is yours, Elijah. Sign the legal papers or face the cartel. I completely ended the call and dropped the burner phone into my purse. Elijah spent his adult life wrapped in tailored suits, projecting the ultimate image of a wealthy real estate developer. He thought his plan to fake his death in a boating accident was a masterpiece of criminal engineering. He thought he successfully escaped the federal indictment and secured a $5 million stolen fortune. But my phone call to his Belizean hotel completely shattered his arrogant delusion. The moment I informed him that I seized his entire offshore account and rerouted his stolen millions into a restricted federal holding fund, he realized he was a dead man walking. He was stranded in a foreign country with no liquid capital, and he owed a $2 million debt to a cartel. When the cartel associates realized the initial wire transfers bounced, they immediately began actively hunting him down across the tropical island. Elijah was forced to completely abandon his luxury beachfront villa, leaving behind his expensive luggage and the beautiful brunette woman he had brought along to celebrate his fake death. He spent 3 agonizing days running through the sweltering heat, terrified and broke. He could not risk walking into an international airport because his passport would instantly trigger a massive federal alert. Driven by pure survival instinct, he managed to bribe a corrupt dock worker with his solid gold watch to secure a hiding spot deep inside the dark hull of an industrial cargo ship bound for the United States. The journey back to the mainland was an absolute nightmare of physical suffering and profound psychological torture. The man who was once the highly respected patriarch of the Dubois family spent 5 miserable days surrounded by the suffocating smell of thick diesel fuel and salty ocean water. He was forced to hide like a terrified rat between massive steel shipping containers, surviving on stolen scraps of stale food and warm bottled water. When the heavy cargo ship finally docked at a busy commercial port under the cover of darkness, Elijah slipped quietly over the side and dropped onto the concrete pier. He was completely filthy, his expensive clothes torn and stained with dark engine grease. His perfectly groomed hair was wild, and his face was covered in a thick beard. The charismatic community leader was entirely gone. He had been completely stripped of his wealthy facade and reduced to a desperate, hungry, and dangerous fugitive. He managed to steal a prepaid cellular phone from an unlocked delivery truck and began walking toward the dark city outskirts. He was completely out of time, out of options, and entirely out of his mind. He knew he had to contact me to secure his absolute survival. I was sitting in my private home office, enjoying the silence, when my cell phone began to vibrate across my desk. The caller identification displayed an unknown local number. I answered the device knowing exactly who was on the other end. "Vivian," he gasped, his voice completely raspy and trembling with severe exhaustion. "I made it back into the country. I am currently hiding near the industrial shipping yards. Please, you have to help me right now. The cartel sent men looking for me, and the federal authorities are raiding my offices. I cannot walk into your attorney's office in the afternoon to sign those legal divorce papers. If I step into the bright daylight, someone will recognize my face and call the police. I will be arrested before I can pick up a pen." I listened to his pathetic pleading and felt an incredible wave of absolute cold satisfaction. He was entirely broken and at my absolute mercy. "You created this massive disaster entirely by yourself." "Elijah," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, "you forged your son's signature on toxic federal loans and tried to leave me entirely bankrupt. You do not get to dictate the specific terms of your surrender." But Elijah was a cornered predator, and his desperation pushed him to beg for his miserable life. "I will sign absolutely anything you want, Vivian," he promised, his voice cracking with panic. "I will legally surrender every piece of the marital estate and walk away from the legacy forever. But you have to give me something in return. I need cash to secure a new identity and quietly disappear across the southern border. If you do not give me money, I will be forced to turn myself into the federal authorities, and I will tell them you were completely involved in the real estate fraud." He actually thought he possessed enough leverage to successfully blackmail a retired senior federal compliance director. I smiled coldly, staring at the dark window of my office. I had perfectly anticipated his desperate demand for escape funds. I decided to offer him the exact bait he needed to walk directly into my final trap. I withdrew $500,000 in completely untraceable physical cash yesterday morning. I lied smoothly, my voice sounding incredibly convincing. I pulled the money from a secure private vault before the federal agents officially locked down your remaining local accounts. I packed the cash into a solid black leather briefcase. It is more than enough money for you to buy a brand new identity and completely vanish into South America forever. I will gladly trade this briefcase for your legal signatures on the absolute asset surrender documents and the permanent divorce papers. Elijah let out a massive sigh of profound relief, genuinely believing his brilliant manipulation had successfully worked. He thought he outsmarted me one final time. "Yes," he breathed heavily. "That is completely perfect, Vivian. I will sign the papers and take the cash tonight." Elijah frantically dictated the terms of our final midnight exchange. "We need to meet somewhere completely isolated." He rushed his voice thick with deep, nervous paranoia. "We can meet behind the old abandoned textile warehouse on the east side of the city, or we can meet at the cheap roadside motel near the interstate highway. Bring the leather briefcase and the legal documents and come completely alone. If I see a single police cruiser or hear a single siren, I will immediately run away and you will never see me again." I cut him off completely, refusing to let him control the narrative of his own destruction. "We are not meeting at a dirty motel or an abandoned warehouse, Elijah," I stated with absolute cold authority. "I am bringing the $500,000 and the legal paperwork to a location of my own specific choosing. You will meet me at exactly midnight, and you will come completely alone." "Where are we meeting?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a deep, terrifying apprehension. I paused for a brief moment, letting the heavy silence completely fill the cellular connection. "We are meeting at the Mount Calvary Community Cemetery." I announced, my words dropping like incredibly heavy stones into a dark and bottomless well. "We are going to conduct our final business transaction standing directly over the exact burial plot where your empty mahogany coffin was lowered into the muddy ground just a few days ago." Elijah gasped loudly, completely horrified by the dark, poetic symbolism of my chosen location. "You cannot be serious, Vivian," he whispered, his body trembling at the terrifying thought of visiting his own fake grave in the middle of the night. "That place is completely exposed and entirely insane. I am not going there tonight." I did not leave any room for his pathetic arguments. "That is the only place we are meeting, Elijah," I replied, my tone uncompromising and entirely absolute. "You wanted everyone to believe you were dead and buried, so it is only fitting that we finalize your absolute destruction right there. I will be waiting for you by your expensive marble headstone at exactly midnight. If you are not standing there when the clock strikes 12, I will completely burn the briefcase full of cash, and I will personally hand your exact location over to the violent cartel associates." I ended the call, completely cutting off his desperate protests. I walked to my bedroom and prepared for the final confrontation. I wore a long, dark wool coat and sensible leather shoes. I picked up a solid black leather briefcase and walked out into the cold night air. The heavy fog was already rolling through the dark city streets as I drove toward the quiet cemetery. But Elijah had absolutely no intention of simply signing the legal papers and walking away peacefully. He was a deeply malicious and greedy predator who firmly believed he was entitled to everything. He arrived at the dark graveyard just before midnight, his filthy clothes blending perfectly into the thick rolling fog. He crept silently through the rows of cold stone markers, his heart pounding violently in his chest. He was not planning to negotiate a peaceful surrender. He reached into the pocket of his dark jacket and tightly gripped the cold steel handle of a fully loaded gun. The midnight air inside the Mount Calvary Community Cemetery was freezing and completely saturated with a thick, rolling fog that clung to the damp ground like a heavy gray blanket. The tall wrought iron gates of the graveyard had been securely locked hours ago, but Elijah had easily found a broken section of the rusted perimeter fence to slip through unnoticed. He walked slowly down the narrow gravel paths, his ruined designer shoes stepping carefully over the damp and muddy grass to avoid making any loud noises in the absolute silence of the night. The massive stone mausoleums and the tall granite headstones loomed in the absolute darkness, looking like silent witnesses to his profound desperation and total ruin. He was shivering uncontrollably from the biting cold and the severe physical exhaustion of his miserable 5-day journey hidden deep inside the dark hull of the industrial cargo ship. His once expensive tailored clothes were completely covered in dark engine grease and dried salt water, and his handsome face was hidden beneath a thick, unkempt beard. He gripped the cold steel handle of the fully loaded gun, safely tucked inside his dark jacket pocket, feeling a dark and violent surge of adrenaline pumping rapidly through his terrified veins. He had absolutely no intention of simply signing the legal divorce papers and walking away peacefully into the night. He planned to aggressively force me to hand over the black leather briefcase containing the $500,000 in untraceable cash, and then he was going to permanently eliminate the only person who could successfully testify against him in a federal court of law. He turned down a highly familiar pathway navigating the silent rows of the deceased until he finally reached the newly developed section of the sprawling cemetery. The fog was incredibly dense in this specific area, completely obscuring the moonlight, but he could faintly see the dark outline of his own freshly dug burial plot. He took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. He fully expected to find me waiting nervously by the edge of the muddy dirt, completely terrified of the dark and isolating environment. But as the heavy fog slowly parted in the cold wind, he stopped dead in his tracks, completely stunned by the sight in front of him. I was not standing nervously in the wet grass. I was sitting perfectly still and completely calm directly on top of his incredibly expensive polished marble headstone, wearing my long dark wool coat and sensible leather shoes. The solid black leather briefcase was resting securely on my lap, and my hands were folded peacefully over the top of the brass latches. I did not look like a grieving widow or a frightened victim waiting to be robbed. I looked like an absolute queen sitting on a throne of cold stone, presiding over his massive string of pathetic failures. I heard the loud crunch of his footsteps on the wet gravel, and I slowly turned my head to look directly at him. He stepped out of the heavy fog looking absolutely pathetic and entirely unrecognizable from the wealthy real estate developer I had married 15 years ago. I did not gasp or show a single ounce of fear when he finally revealed himself in the dark graveyard. I simply stared at the filthy and broken man standing just a few feet away from me. "Hello, Elijah," I said, my voice carrying perfectly through the freezing and silent air. "You look absolutely terrible." Elijah did not appreciate my incredibly calm and completely unbothered observation. He aggressively pulled his right hand out of his dark jacket pocket and quickly raised the heavy loaded gun, pointing the cold steel barrel directly at the center of my chest. His hand was shaking slightly from the freezing cold, but his dark eyes were completely filled with a malicious and murderous intent. "Do not say another word to me, Vivian," he growled, his voice raspy and dripping with pure toxic hatred. "Just slide the briefcase full of cash across the wet grass and hand me a pen so I can sign those pathetic divorce papers right now. You think you are so incredibly smart sitting there on my headstone, but you are completely out of your league tonight." He took a slow and threatening step closer, keeping the deadly weapon aimed steadily at my heart. He completely dropped the charismatic and generous community leader facade he had meticulously maintained for the past 15 years. The charming patriarch of the Dubois family was entirely gone, replaced by a bitter and incredibly resentful predator who was finally showing his true colors in the dark. "I hated living with you, Vivian." He spat his face contorting into an ugly mask of absolute rage. "I hated waking up every single morning in a massive house that you purchased entirely with your federal government salary. You were always hovering over my shoulder, always asking invasive questions about my business accounts, and always demanding to review my corporate financial statements. You made me feel incredibly small and entirely inadequate every single day of our miserable marriage. I had massive visions for my real estate firm, and I truly wanted to build a generational legacy for my son, but you completely suffocated my grand ambitions. You were nothing but a boring federal auditor who completely refused to take risks, and you constantly held me back from achieving my true potential as a wealthy man. I had to fake my own death just to finally breathe freely and completely escape your constant suffocating judgment." He waved the heavy gun aggressively in the dark, damp air, his breathing becoming rapid and completely erratic as his panic slowly began to rise. "Now slide the briefcase over to me right now," he demanded, his voice echoing loudly off the surrounding marble statues. "I am going to take the $500,000, and I am going to build a brand new life far away from your miserable, strict rules. If you try to scream for help or run away, I will shoot you right here and leave you to rot next to my empty wooden coffin." "You brought this entirely upon yourself, Vivian. I sat perfectly still on the cold marble headstone, looking directly down the dark barrel of his fully loaded weapon. I did not flinch, and I did not beg for my life. I simply let out a sharp and incredibly cold laugh that sliced through the freezing graveyard air like a physical blade. My absolute lack of fear completely unnerved him, causing his shaking hands to grip the heavy gun even tighter. You are standing directly over your own empty grave, holding a stolen weapon, and wearing clothes that smell like a massive garbage dump, I noted calmly. And yet you still possess the absolute audacity to blame me for your catastrophic life failures. I slowly stood up from the marble headstone, holding the heavy black leather briefcase firmly by my side. I did not step away from him. I stepped directly toward the barrel of the gun, closing the physical distance between us until I was standing right in front of him. You did not fake your death because you wanted to escape my judgment. Elijah, I stated, my voice radiating pure and undeniable authority. You faked your death because you did not have the spine to actually live your own life. You are a complete coward who ran away the exact second the federal authorities noticed your incredibly sloppy real estate fraud. You did not have grand ambitions. You had a massive ego and a complete inability to do honest hard work. I paused, letting my harsh words completely sink into his arrogant brain. You say that I suffocated you, I continued, my tone dropping into a dangerous and highly ruthless register. I did not suffocate you, Elijah. I completely subsidized you. I paid for your expensive tailored suits, your luxury vehicles, and your extravagant community donations. You played the wealthy patriarch using my hard-earned federal salary because you were completely incapable of funding your own lavish lifestyle. And when your fraudulent business finally collapsed, you deliberately forged the signature of your own biological son, setting him up to take the absolute fall for your federal crimes. You left Kendrick to face a 20-year prison sentence while you desperately tried to escape to a tropical island with your young, naive mistress. You are not a visionary real estate developer, Elijah. You are a pathetic and incredibly weak parasite who completely destroys anyone foolish enough to trust you. And now you are standing here begging the woman you actively tried to bankrupt for a fraction of the money you already carelessly threw away. Elijah stared at me, completely unable to process the absolute truth of my devastating words. His massive ego completely shattered under the sheer weight of his undeniable reality. He finally realized that I saw right through his pathetic lies and that I was completely unafraid of his violent physical threats. His deep sorrow and profound humiliation instantly transformed into a blind and explosive rage. He realized he could not successfully manipulate me or intimidate me, so he decided to simply destroy me. He raised the heavy steel weapon, aiming it directly at my face. He pulled the hammer back with a loud and terrifying metallic click, completely ready to pull the trigger and end my life in the middle of the dark cemetery. "Give me the briefcase right now, Vivian," he screamed, his voice breaking with pure, desperate madness. "Give me the briefcase, Vivian." Elijah held the heavy steel weapon perfectly level with my face, his hand shaking violently from the freezing graveyard wind and his own absolute sheer terror. He screamed at me to hand over the black leather briefcase, demanding the $500,000 in untraceable physical cash that he desperately needed to escape the violent cartel and the federal authorities. I stood completely still in the dark, damp grass, looking directly down the barrel of his loaded gun. I did not raise my hands in surrender, and I absolutely refused to beg a pathetic coward for my own life. I looked into his wild, bloodshot eyes, and I felt an overwhelming sense of profound calm wash over my entire body. "You want the briefcase so badly, Elijah?" I asked, my voice echoing with a cold and ruthless authority that completely defied his violent threats. "You are entirely willing to murder your own wife, standing directly over your own fake grave just to secure your stolen escape funds." I slowly lowered my arm and placed the heavy black leather briefcase directly onto the wet grass, resting it right at the base of his expensive polished marble headstone. I did not hand it to him. I simply set it down in the freezing mud. Elijah stared at the briefcase, his desperate eyes widening with a hungry and incredibly toxic greed. He thought his violent intimidation had successfully forced my complete compliance. He took a hasty step forward, keeping the gun pointed at my chest as he eagerly reached his free hand down toward the brass latches. But before his filthy fingers could even touch the smooth leather handle, I quickly raised my sensible leather shoe and violently kicked the side of the briefcase. My sudden and aggressive movement completely startled him, causing him to jump backward in the wet grass. The forceful impact of my heavy shoe struck the locking mechanism perfectly. The brass latches instantly snapped open with a loud, sharp click that echoed across the silent rows of granite tombstones. The heavy leather lid flipped completely open, exposing the entire interior of the briefcase to the cold midnight air. Elijah stared down at the open case, expecting to see thick stacks of untraceable $100 bills neatly wrapped in paper bands. He expected to see his ultimate salvation and his permanent ticket to a brand new life in South America. But the black leather briefcase was completely and absolutely empty. There was absolutely no money inside. The only thing resting inside the massive empty void of the briefcase was a single crisp piece of white paper. Elijah frowned deeply, his confused mind struggling to process the visual reality of the empty leather box. He slowly leaned forward, squinting in the heavy rolling fog to read the bold black text printed across the top of the single sheet of paper. It was a certified copy of his official Internal Revenue Service federal indictment. I had brought him his absolute final judgment. The devastating realization hit Elijah with the massive physical force of a speeding freight train. He stared at the official federal indictment resting inside the empty black briefcase, and his entire world violently collapsed into a million irreparable pieces. The untraceable cash was nothing more than a brilliantly constructed lie designed to lure him completely out of his hiding spot and directly into my absolute control. I had masterfully manipulated his incredibly predictable greed and his profound desperation. I played him for an absolute fool, and he had walked willingly into the exact center of my final trap. His chest began to heave with rapid and completely erratic breaths as the sheer magnitude of my total deception finally washed over his arrogant brain. He realized that he had completely exposed himself, stepping out of the shadows and confessing his violent intentions for absolutely nothing in return. His profound shock instantly morphed into a dark, explosive, and utterly uncontrollable rage. "You lied to me!" he screamed at the top of his lungs, his raspy voice tearing through the freezing midnight air like a wounded animal. "You set me up, Vivian. You brought me out here to completely humiliate me, and you never had the money." His face contorted into a deeply ugly mask of pure malicious hatred and unhinged madness. He gripped the heavy steel gun with both of his shaking hands, raising the weapon and aiming it directly at the center of my forehead. His finger tightened aggressively around the metal trigger. He was entirely ready to pull the trigger to end my life right there in the muddy graveyard. "I am going to kill you right now," he roared, stepping aggressively forward, crushing the wet grass beneath his ruined designer shoes. I did not flinch, and I did not take a single step backward. I simply stood my ground, staring directly into the eyes of a completely broken predator. "You are not going anywhere, Elijah," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady despite the loaded weapon pointed at my face. "You are entirely out of time, and you are completely surrounded." Elijah let out a harsh and incredibly bitter laugh, completely refusing to believe me. He thought I was desperately bluffing to save my own life. "There is absolutely nobody out here but us. Vivian!" he snarled, preparing to fire the deadly weapon. But the exact second his finger began to squeeze the trigger, the dark and isolated cemetery was violently interrupted. A loud electronic chirp echoed across the silent graveyard, instantly followed by the deafening mechanical hum of massive industrial generators roaring to life. Before Elijah could even comprehend the sudden noise, the entire newly developed section of the Mount Calvary Cemetery was instantly illuminated. Dozens of massive tactical floodlights completely shattered the midnight darkness, instantly turning the pitch-black graveyard into a blinding stadium of brilliant white light. The heavy rolling fog glowed intensely, completely blinding Elijah, and forcing him to instinctively raise his free arm to shield his highly sensitive eyes from the incredibly harsh glare. The absolute darkness he had desperately relied on to conceal his violent crimes was entirely stripped away, leaving him utterly exposed in the center of the muddy burial plot. The blinding tactical floodlights were instantly followed by the loud, authoritative sounds of heavy boots charging across the wet gravel pathways. Elijah lowered his arms, squinting frantically through the brilliant light, and his heart stopped beating in his chest. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and fully equipped local police tactical units stepped out from behind the massive granite mausoleums and tall marble headstones. They completely surrounded the burial plot, forming an inescapable circle of highly trained law enforcement officers holding tactical rifles and heavy shields. Their laser sights cut through the glowing fog, painting dozens of bright red dots directly onto Elijah's filthy dark jacket and terrified face. "Drop the weapon immediately and get down on the ground," a commanding voice roared through a massive electronic megaphone, drowning out the cold wind. "Federal agents, drop the gun right now, or we will open fire." Elijah froze, paralyzed by the overwhelming magnitude of the law enforcement presence. He looked around the illuminated cemetery, realizing every single escape route was blocked by an impenetrable wall of armed federal agents. He slowly turned his head to look back at me, his eyes wide with sheer terror and profound confusion. How did they know? He whispered, his voice trembling violently as he realized the totality of his complete destruction. I stood perfectly still in the center of the tactical lights, feeling an incredible sense of absolute victory and profound vindication. I slowly reached up with my right hand and unbuttoned the top section of my long, dark wool coat. I pulled the thick fabric aside, revealing a small black microphone and a complex network of wires securely taped directly to my silk blouse. "I have been wearing a federal surveillance wire this entire time, Elijah," I explained, my voice ringing clearly across the illuminated graveyard. "Every single word you spoke tonight was actively transmitted directly to the federal authorities waiting silently in the shadows. We recorded your confession about the massive real estate fraud, your admission of faking your own death, and your violent threats against my life. I did not come out here to negotiate a peaceful surrender with a dangerous fugitive. I came out here to successfully extract a fully recorded federal confession and legally bury you forever." Elijah stared at the recording device strapped to my chest, destroyed by the inescapable trap I had meticulously built around him. He thought he was hunting a vulnerable widow, but he was walking directly into the massive jaws of a coordinated federal sting operation. He had absolutely nothing left. He had no stolen millions, no loyal mistress, no golden child, and no freedom. He was entirely broke, surrounded by federal agents, and staring directly at the official Internal Revenue Service indictment resting inside an empty black briefcase. The commanding voice erupted through the electronic megaphone for a second time, echoing violently across the cold tombstones. I said, "Drop the weapon right now and get on the ground," the federal agent shouted with final authority. The bright red laser sights shifted slightly, focusing entirely on the center of his chest. Elijah realized his massive criminal game was permanently over. His trembling hand slowly opened and the heavy steel gun slipped from his desperate grip. The deadly weapon fell through the cold midnight air and landed with a dull thud in the muddy grass right next to the empty black leather briefcase. His knees buckled completely, unable to support the crushing weight of his absolute defeat. Elijah slowly collapsed, falling heavily to his knees, directly on top of the wet dirt of his own fake grave. The heavy steel gun hit the muddy grass with a dull thud, completely neutralizing the immediate lethal threat. The exact second the weapon left his trembling hands, the tactical perimeter violently collapsed inward. A dozen heavily armed federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation alongside local police tactical units sprinted out from the blinding glare of the massive industrial floodlights. Their heavy combat boots pounded aggressively against the wet gravel pathways and splashed through the freezing puddles of the dark cemetery. Elijah remained entirely frozen on his knees, directly on top of his own freshly dug burial plot, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming and sudden manifestation of his absolute doom. 2 massive federal agents reached him first, tackling his exhausted and filthy body forcefully face down into the wet mud. The physical impact knocked the remaining breath directly out of his lungs, causing him to gasp loudly in the freezing midnight air. They grabbed his arms, pulling them violently behind his back with absolute professional ruthlessness. The sharp and terrifying metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed sharply against the surrounding marble headstones. He was pinned directly against the cold earth of the exact grave he had purchased to fake his own tragic death. The tactical floodlights cast long, harsh shadows across the cemetery, illuminating the complete and total destruction of the wealthy real estate developer. He struggled weakly against the crushing weight of the federal agents pinning him to the ground, but his physical strength was entirely depleted by his miserable 5-day journey hidden inside the dark industrial cargo ship. As the agents hauled him roughly to his knees, his face was completely covered in thick brown mud, and his ruined designer jacket was soaked through with freezing rainwater. The profound shock of his sudden capture rapidly morphed into a wild and completely unhinged, furious desperation. He whipped his head around his bloodshot eyes, frantically searching the blinding lights, until they finally locked directly onto my completely calm face. I stood perfectly still just a few feet away, watching his entire world violently collapse with absolute cold satisfaction. "You are a complete monster, Vivian," he screamed at the top of his lungs, his raspy voice tearing through the quiet graveyard like a feral animal caught in a brutal steel trap. "You planned this entire massive betrayal from the very beginning. You set me up to take the fall, and you completely ruined my entire life. You are a cold and heartless monster, and I absolutely curse the day I ever met you." He thrashed aggressively against the strong grip of the arresting officers, spitting mud and venomous insults into the freezing air. He genuinely believed his own pathetic lies, completely refusing to accept that his own massive greed and incredible arrogance had constructed this inescapable federal prison. He thought he was the tragic victim of a bitter and vengeful wife, completely ignoring the absolute fact that he had orchestrated a massive real estate fraud, abandoned his naive young mistress, and actively framed his own biological son for a 20-year federal prison sentence. He screamed my name over and over again, his voice echoing wildly off the massive granite mausoleums as the armed federal agents firmly held him down in the wet grass. The blinding tactical lights illuminated his profound, pathetic misery for the entire world to finally witness. I did not flinch or back away from his violent and completely unhinged screaming. I did not offer a single ounce of pity or a single word of apology for dismantling his massive criminal empire. I simply smoothed the front of my long, dark wool coat and took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the physical distance between us until I was standing directly over his kneeling, filthy body. The armed federal agents respectfully stepped back slightly, allowing me the absolute final word with the fugitive ghost I had successfully hunted down. I looked down at the pathetic and completely broken man who had spent 15 years living a lavish life entirely funded by my hard-earned federal salary. His expensive tailored suits were completely gone, replaced by dark engine grease and freezing cemetery mud. His charismatic community leader facade was entirely shattered, leaving behind nothing but a weak and incredibly desperate coward. I looked directly into his wild, terrified eyes, and I let the absolute heavy silence of my total victory completely crush whatever remaining defiant spirit he possessed. "You wanted to be dead, Elijah," I said, my voice perfectly calm and radiating an incredibly cold and ruthless authority that easily cut through the chaotic noise of the graveyard. "You completely abandoned your entire life, your family, and your responsibilities because you did not have the basic spine to face the federal consequences of your incredibly sloppy real estate fraud. You wanted everyone in this city to believe you were tragically resting at the bottom of the ocean so you could steal $5 million and disappear to a tropical island." I paused, letting the freezing midnight wind blow across the silent rows of granite headstones as my words sank deeply into his arrogant brain. "Well, you successfully got exactly what you desperately wanted, Elijah. I continued, my tone dropping into a dangerous and absolute finality. "Now you officially are entirely dead to me. You are completely dead to this community, and you are permanently dead to the wealthy social circles you desperately manipulated for decades. You have absolutely no money, no legacy, and no future left in this world." I slowly reached down and picked up the empty black leather briefcase from the wet grass, securely snapping the brass latches completely shut. "Enjoy the concrete box, Elijah," I whispered, my voice echoing with profound finality as I stared down at his horrified face. "It is significantly smaller than the expensive wooden one you bought to bury yourself in." Elijah let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure, total despair, completely broken by the absolute truth of my devastating words. He finally realized that he had completely lost everything and that I had successfully outsmarted him at every single turn. He hung his head, his chin resting heavily against his chest as he began to openly sob in the freezing mud. I turned my back to him, completely unbothered by his pathetic tears. I gave the lead federal agent a brief and polite nod, signaling that I was entirely finished with the dangerous fugitive. The agents immediately hauled Elijah up to his feet, dragging his heavy, exhausted body across the wet gravel pathway toward the waiting procession of armored police vehicles. I stood perfectly still in the blinding tactical lights, watching them shove him roughly into the back of a dark transport van, completely erasing him from my life forever. The massive, heavy steel doors of the federal transport van slammed completely shut, violently severing Elijah from the free world forever, as the long convoy of flashing red and blue law enforcement vehicles slowly drove out of the dark cemetery gates. The absolute reality of his new, miserable existence immediately began. He was transported directly to the heavily fortified downtown federal processing facility, surrounded by armed guards who treated him exactly like the dangerous flight risk he truly was. There was absolutely no special treatment or polite professional courtesy extended to the former wealthy real estate developer. He was aggressively stripped of his filthy, ruined clothing and forced to stand entirely naked in a freezing concrete holding cell while officers meticulously documented every single detail of his physical identity. The charismatic smile he had used to charm wealthy investors and naive mistresses was completely gone, replaced by a hollow and entirely vacant stare. He was handed a scratchy neon orange prison jumpsuit and a pair of cheap plastic sandals, completely stripping away the last remaining shreds of his massive, arrogant ego. The processing officers aggressively fingerprinted him, rolling his trembling fingers across the dark ink pads to securely log his identity into the permanent federal database. He was violently shoved into a small, brightly lit room and forced to hold a black plastic board displaying his official federal inmate number across his chest. The bright flash of the booking camera captured his completely ruined and devastated face, permanently immortalizing his massive, catastrophic downfall for the entire world to eventually see. The local morning news stations quickly obtained his official mugshot and immediately broadcast the absolute shocking truth across every single television screen in the wealthy suburbs. The highly respected community leader, who had supposedly died in a tragic boating accident, had actually been arrested alive and completely filthy in a dark graveyard after attempting to execute a massive federal tax evasion and wire fraud scheme. His carefully constructed legacy was completely and utterly destroyed overnight. The affluent socialites who had attended his elegant repast and offered fake tears of sympathy instantly turned completely against him, expressing their profound public disgust, and quickly attempting to distance themselves from his toxic criminal empire. The massive real estate development firm he had built was immediately seized by the Department of Justice, and his remaining local assets were permanently frozen and completely liquidated to pay the incredibly massive federal fines. He was locked away inside a tiny, windowless concrete cell far away from the beautiful white sand beaches and expensive tropical cocktails he had desperately dreamed of. He had completely sacrificed his own biological son, his young, naive mistress, and his entire prestigious reputation for a stolen fortune he was never actually allowed to spend. He was legally booked into the maximum security federal prison system entirely under his real name, officially confirming to the government and the entire world that Elijah Dubois was very much alive and facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 25 consecutive years behind heavy iron bars. He was completely alone, terrified, and entirely bankrupt. I had successfully buried the ghost and permanently secured my massive financial empire, protecting my absolute peace from his toxic grasp forever. But as the dark storm clouds finally began to clear over my quiet, beautiful estate, a massive, unresolved question still heavily lingered in the warm morning air. The dangerous fugitive was successfully locked away in a concrete box, but what exactly happens to the stolen church funds and the incredibly greedy stepson who tried to ruin me? The Sunday morning sun rose over the city with a clarity that had been missing for weeks. I spent the early hours in my kitchen, watching the golden light play across the polished surfaces of my home. This was my sanctuary. I dressed with care, choosing a suit of cream linen and a hat that commanded attention. I was not going to church out of habit. I was going to finish what started at that altar. As I pulled into the parking lot of Mount Calvary, I noticed the usual Sunday bustle was missing. People stood in quiet groups and were not whispering. They were watching. I stepped out of my car and the heat of the Georgia morning hit me, but I did not let it slow my pace. The click of my heels on the pavement was the only sound as I walked toward the wooden doors. I pushed them open, and the cool air greeted me alongside a silence so profound it felt like a wall. The church was full of the congregation sitting in the pews they had occupied for generations. Usually there is a hum of gossip, but today the silence was absolute. It was a heavy silence built from their collective shame. I walked down the center aisle and did not look to the left or the right. I saw the deacons out of the corner of my eye. These were the men who had glared at me and called for my removal. They could not even look me in the eye today. They stared at the floor. They remembered calling me a thief. They remembered calling me a woman who had lost her mind. I walked with my head held high. I was not there as a grieving widow or as a defendant. I was there as the woman who had survived every trap. I reached the third row where the Dubois family had sat for 15 years. I did not sit down. I stood in the aisle and looked up at Pastor Lewis. He was standing behind the pulpit, and his face was etched with regret. The congregation held its breath as I moved toward the altar. I could feel their eyes on my back, but I did not look back. I was focused on the truth. I walked up the steps to the altar. This was the same place where Kendrick had stood and cried his crocodile tears. This was the same place where Elijah had pretended to be a pillar of the community, while he was plotting to steal from the people who called him brother. Pastor Lewis stepped forward to meet me. His hands were shaking, and he looked like a man who had not slept. "Sister Vivian," he began, but his voice failed him. He cleared his throat. "We have all been praying for a miracle in this house," he said softly. I looked at him, and then I turned to look at the deacons in the front row. "You did not need to pray for a miracle," I replied, so every person could hear me. "You just needed to believe in the truth." I reached into the pocket of my linen jacket and pulled out an envelope. I did not raise my voice, but the silence was so deep that every word carried. "My husband and his son took more than just money from this church," I said. "They took your hope, and they tried to use my name to hide their tracks. They wanted you to believe that the woman who helped build this sanctuary was tearing it down." I turned to face the congregation. They looked like children waiting to be scolded. I opened the envelope and pulled out a certified check. "This is not a donation," I stated clearly. "This is a restoration." I handed the check to Pastor Lewis and watched as his eyes widened. $2 million, the exact amount that had been siphoned away into Elijah's shell companies. The sanctuary gasped, and the sound was like a wind through the trees. Some people began to cry. "The Community Housing Fund is fully restored," I announced. "The builders will begin their work on Monday. Mount Calvary will not be a casualty of one man's greed." I had tracked every penny and used my own liquid assets to bridge the gap while the legal system processed the rest. I was not just giving them money, I was giving them their future back. Pastor Lewis tried to thank me, but I held up a hand. "Do not thank me, Pastor," I said. "Just remember this day the next time someone comes to you with a lie. Truth does not need to shout, it just needs to be held by a woman who knows her worth. The headlines in the following days were a relentless and satisfying montage of justice served cold. I sat in my living room and watched the local news reports as the Dubois name was finally being scrubbed clean by the legal system. The first report was about Kendrick. My arrogant stepson had tried to play the victim right up until the end. He sat in that courtroom in a suit that was suddenly too large for him because he had lost weight from the stress. He begged the judge for leniency and tried to blame his father for every signature he had ever forged. But the judge was not interested in his excuses. For the wire fraud and for the systematic embezzlement of the church funds, Kendrick was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. He cried like a child as the bailiffs led him away in chains. Then there was Lauren. My entitled daughter-in-law had realized too late that co-signing those loans was her ultimate undoing. She filed for bankruptcy a week after the federal assets were seized. Her designer clothes were sold at auction, and her luxury car was repossessed in the middle of the night. The news showed a brief clip of her walking into a local retail store wearing a cheap uniform. She was working for minimum wage and living in a small studio apartment. She had gone from the country club to the stockroom in a matter of months. But the biggest headline was reserved for the ghost. Elijah Dubois was finally held accountable for the massive real estate fraud and the elaborate faking of his own death. The federal judge called him a predator without a soul. He was sentenced to 25 years in a federal prison. At 65 years old, it was a life sentence. He would die behind a concrete wall instead of on a beach in Belize. His legacy was the inmate number he would carry for the rest of his natural life. I watched the screen as his mugshot flickered one last time, and I turned off the television. The accounts were finally settled, and the debts were paid. As the service at Mount Calvary began to wrap up, the energy in the room shifted. It was no longer a place of shame, but a place of celebration. People were standing and trying to reach out to touch my arm as I walked back toward the pews. They wanted to welcome me back. They wanted me to take my rightful place in the third row, where the brass plaque with the Dubois name still caught the light. Pastor Lewis called out from the pulpit for me to join the deacons for a prayer of thanksgiving, and he pointed to the empty seat in the front row, the seat of honor. I stopped and looked at the row I had sat in for 15 years. I looked at the faces of the people who had been so quick to condemn me. I felt the weight of their expectations and their sudden need for my approval. I realized in that moment that I did not belong in that row anymore. I did not belong in this sanctuary at all. I had spent my life trying to fit into their small boxes and trying to be the supportive wife of a man who was nothing more than a hollow shell. I had grown larger than their minds and their brittle loyalties. I looked up at Pastor Lewis and gave him a polite nod. I did not say a single word. I did not take the seat in the front row, and I did not return to the third row. I simply turned around and walked toward the back of the church. I kept my pace steady and my eyes forward. I pushed open the wooden doors and stepped out into the bright sun. The air was fresh, and it belonged only to me. I walked to my car and drove away from Mount Calvary for the last time. I had restored their kingdom, but I had finally built my own. I had outgrown the lies and the people who believed them. I was free and safe. But as I watched the church disappear in my rearview mirror, I realized there was one final set of accounts. My sisters. The morning sun in the state of Georgia has a specific way of washing the world clean, especially when you are finally viewing it through eyes that are no longer clouded by the heavy veil of grief or the suffocating weight of a husband's lies. I sat on my sprawling back porch that afternoon, watching the golden light filter through the ancient oak trees that stood like giant sentinels at the far edge of my property. The heavy gray humidity that had hung over the cemetery on the day of the funeral was completely gone, replaced by a crisp and invigorating warmth that felt like a long-awaited blessing from the heavens above. My home, which had once felt like a cold museum of someone else's secrets, was finally mine again in every physical and emotional sense of the word. I had spent the last several weeks meticulously stripping away the heavy floral curtains and the dark mahogany furniture that Elijah had insisted on during our marriage. I replaced every single one of those depressing items with light linens, soft creams, and open spaces that finally allowed this massive house to breathe along with me. There were no more shredded documents hidden in the corners of the home office, and no more locked desk drawers containing the terrifying secrets of offshore accounts or forged real estate deeds. The air inside these walls was finally light and pure, as if the house itself had been scrubbed of a lingering illness. I watched a bright blue jay land on the bird feeder I had recently installed in the garden. It was such a simple and quiet pleasure that I never had the luxury to enjoy when I was busy subsidizing a fugitive's lifestyle or tracking down missing church funds. I felt a profound sense of physical relief in my shoulders, as if a heavy stone mantle had been lifted off my back after decades of labor. For 15 years, I had played the role of the supportive and loyal wife to a hollow and manipulative man. For a few terrifying weeks, I had played the role of the grieving widow in a public theater of betrayal and greed. But today, on this beautiful and sun-drenched porch, I was simply Vivian. The house was quiet, and the quiet was not lonely or frightening. It was a triumphant and absolute victory of the spirit. I looked out at the green lawn and realized that I had finally outlived the tragedy. I was 61 years old, and my life was not over. It was only just beginning on my own terms. The white paint on the railing was smooth under my fingers, and the scent of blooming jasmine was sweet and intoxicating. I was free from the expectations of a man who never deserved my loyalty, and I was finally resting in the truth of my own resilience and incredible strength. It was a perfect day to start a new chapter as a whole person. The true measure of a woman is not found in her country club membership or the luxury brand of the car she drives, but in who remains standing beside her when the floodlights are turned on and the secrets are revealed. As I sat there enjoying the afternoon, I heard the low, rhythmic, and comforting hum of a lawnmower in the far distance of the estate. I looked out toward the rose garden and saw the old gravedigger moving carefully between the flower beds. His name is Arthur, and I had officially hired him as my head groundskeeper with a generous salary and full benefits that would ensure he never had to dig another grave in the freezing rain for the rest of his life. He was the only person who had the courage to tell me the truth about the empty coffin when everyone else was busy looking for my keys or planning my eviction. He moved with a quiet and earned dignity, now looking after the land that was legally and undeniably mine. A few minutes later, the kitchen door opened, and my true friends walked out onto the porch carrying a silver tray filled with snacks and fresh fruit. These were the women from my neighborhood and my former colleagues at the Internal Revenue Service who had seen through the Dubois lies from the very first day. They did not want my money, and they did not want a seat at a table built on the back of criminal fraud. They just wanted to see me smile again and to celebrate the fact that I was still standing. We sat together in the warmth and talked about our upcoming travel plans instead of the darkness of the past. My massive financial accounts were now completely secure, and the $15 million I had meticulously built through decades of discipline and sacrifice was tucked away in private trusts that no stepson or husband could ever hope to touch again. The federal investigators had officially closed their investigation into my personal finances, and they had declared me a victim of Elijah's coordinated identity theft. I was not just wealthy on a piece of paper or in a digital bank statement. I was wealthy in the absolute peace of my soul. I looked at Arthur as he waved to me from the rose garden, and I knew that every single penny I had spent to restore this beautiful estate was worth the effort. I had successfully built a kingdom where loyalty and honesty were the only currencies that carried any value. The golden years I had imagined were finally here, and they were far more beautiful than I ever expected because they were untainted by the shadows of a dead man's plot. I watched the butterflies dance over the lavender and realized that my true wealth was the safety of my heart and the clarity of my future, which no one could ever take away from me again in life. I reached for the tall glass of iced sweet tea resting on the side table. The glass was cold and covered in a fine mist of silver condensation that caught the bright sunlight like tiny diamonds. I took a slow and deliberate sip, feeling the perfect balance of sugar and lemon soothe my throat and settle my mind. It was the sweet taste of a battle finished and a long war finally won. I pulled a small stack of papers from my lap and looked at the final decree from the court. I was no longer Vivian Dubois. I had legally and proudly reclaimed my maiden name, and I was now officially and legally single. The name Dubois had been systematically erased from my house deeds, my bank accounts, and my life. It was a name associated with empty coffins and forged wills, and I was incredibly glad to be rid of the burden. I looked at the specific spot on the porch where my stepson Kendrick had once stood and tried to intimidate me with his fake court orders and his arrogance. Now he was sitting in a cold concrete cell in a federal prison, learning that a father's love cannot be forged and a mother's strength should never be tested by greed. I thought about Elijah, probably staring at a gray wall right now, realizing that the ghost he created had eventually become his own permanent and miserable reality. I felt absolutely no bitterness or anger toward them anymore. Bitterness is a toxic poison that requires your time and your precious energy, and I had absolutely none left to give to people who were now just small and insignificant footnotes in my long history. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting the sounds of the birds and the wind in the trees fill my mind with a quiet song. I was 61 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I was not living for the approval of a husband or the needs of an ungrateful son or the expectations of a judgmental church. I was living entirely for myself. I was safe, and I was secure in the fortress I had built with my own hands. I had buried the lies deep in the cold earth, and I had successfully climbed out of the grave they tried to dig for me. I was wealthy, and I was completely unbothered by the world outside my gates. The world was wide, and the afternoon was long. I took another sip of my tea and smiled at the sun. Have you ever had to bury someone's lies to uncover your own truth? Tell me your story in the comments below, and remember, the sharpest weapon a woman can have isn't her tongue, it's her bank statement. Music fades. Subscribe for more stories of justice and the power of a woman who knows her worth.